They were the silent hunters of the deep, a force that turned the vast Atlantic Ocean into one of the most dangerous battlefields of the Second World War. Known as the wolf packs, these groups of German U-boats stalked Allied convoys with deadly precision, slipping beneath the waves by day and rising at night to strike with torpedoes that sent merchant ships and war escorts alike to the ocean floor. What began as a handful of submarines at the outbreak of war grew into a terrifying weapon of attrition, designed to choke Britain's lifeline of supplies and starve an island nation into submission. Coordinated by radio, guided by Enigma codes, and emboldened by early successes, the wolf packs spread fear across the seas, their periscopes and silhouettes haunting the minds of sailors and merchant crews who never knew when death might come from below. But for all their ruthlessness, the U-boat war was also a contest of innovation, a battle of sonar and radar, of depth charges and escort carriers, of cryptographers and intelligence officers, waging a silent war to break the codes that kept the wolf packs hunting. Thousands of lives were lost in this desperate struggle, and the Atlantic became a graveyard of steel, oil, and shattered hope. In this documentary, we will trace the rise and fall of the wolf packs, from their early triumphs to their eventual destruction as Allied technology and strategy turned the tide. We will explore the human stories of both hunters and hunted, the captains and crews of the U-boats, and the men aboard the convoys who braved the gauntlet to keep the lifelines open. So stay with us as we dive deep into one of the most relentless struggles of the war, a battle fought not on open fields or city streets, but in the cold and unforgiving depths of the sea. And before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, because remembrance connects us across oceans and across generations, just as the Battle of the Atlantic once did. In the waters of the early 20th century, naval warfare had always been defined by battleships, cruisers, and grand fleets clashing on the surface. But in the shadows of the First World War, a new predator emerged beneath the waves, the submarine. Germany, constrained by the might of the British Royal Navy, sought a weapon that could strike invisibly and undermine Britain's maritime lifeline. The U-boat, short for undersea boot, became that weapon, operating with stealth and terror across the Atlantic. In 1915, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania shocked the world and demonstrated the lethal potential of these silent hunters. German U-boats prowled shipping lanes, sinking merchant ships carrying supplies to Britain and France, cutting into the Allied war effort with ruthless efficiency. The campaign revealed both the strengths and the flaws of submarine warfare, devastating against commerce, yet politically dangerous when civilian lives were lost. The submarine was still a primitive weapon, with limited range, fragile engines, and unreliable torpedoes, but its psychological impact far outweighed its mechanical shortcomings. For Britain, the U-boat menace became an existential threat, one that nearly starved the island nation into submission. By the end of the First World War, U-boats had sunk over 5,000 vessels, shaking the very foundations of Allied logistics. It was a weapon that had proven its worth, and one that would not be forgotten by Germany's future leaders. The lessons of this first submarine war lingered, preparing the stage for an even greater undersea conflict a generation later. When Germany surrendered in 1918, its once formidable fleet of U-boats was dismantled and handed over to the victors. The Treaty of Versailles imposed strict limits, forbidding Germany from building or maintaining submarines. But bans on technology rarely erase knowledge, and German naval officers carried the memory of submarine warfare with them into the interwar years. Secretly, the Reichsmarine studied the tactics, technologies, and failures of the First World War campaign. Naval theorists pored over records, analyzing why U-boats had succeeded in the early stages and why they had faltered once the convoy system was introduced. In hidden offices and under foreign covers, German engineers continued research, often in collaboration with shipyards in neutral or sympathetic nations. These quiet efforts ensured that the know-how of submarine warfare was not extinguished, merely driven underground. Officers such as Karl Donitz, a young naval commander who had served aboard U-boats during the Great War, never forgot the lessons of that brutal campaign. He carried with him the conviction that submarines had been the key to victory, and that if used differently, they could one day strangle Britain completely. While the world moved on, and new treaties sought to preserve peace, Germany's silent warriors were already plotting a return to the depths. The memory of the First World War's U-boat menace remained a powerful ghost haunting the seas. The interwar period saw Germany innovate in secrecy, working around the restrictions of Versailles, in Dutch shipyards, and through covert programs. German naval designers began experimenting with new submarine designs. They analyzed the weaknesses of their old U-boats: short range, mechanical unreliability, poor living conditions, and sought solutions that would make future submarines more lethal and resilient. By collaborating with countries like Spain and the Soviet Union, Germany kept alive its submarine engineering expertise under the guise of commercial or experimental projects. Naval officers drilled in theory, crafting doctrines that emphasize stealth, surprise, and concentration of force. While the world's great powers reduced their navies in an effort to prevent another arms race, German planners envisioned a future where undersea warfare could cripple enemies before surface fleets even clashed. For men like Donitz, the submarine was not merely a weapon, but a philosophy of total economic warfare. Instead of challenging the Royal Navy in open battle, he believed in strangling Britain's supply lines with packs of coordinated U-boats. These theories gained traction within a resurgent Germany after 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power and openly defied the Treaty of Versailles. Suddenly, what had been secret speculation became official policy. The dream of a revived U-boat fleet was about to be realized, not as an afterthought, but as a central pillar of Nazi naval strategy. Adolf Hitler's obsession with building a world-dominating war machine did not initially extend to the sea. He dreamed of great battleships, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, as symbols of German might. Yet even as massive surface warships were laid down, Karl Donitz quietly built the case for submarines as Germany's true strategic weapon. He argued that Britain's survival depended entirely on overseas imports of food, oil, and raw materials. If U-boats could sever that lifeline, Britain could be starved into submission without a single German soldier landing on its shores. Hitler, fascinated by bold ideas that promised decisive victories, began to warm to the concept. Unlike the costly and vulnerable battleships, submarines could be built in large numbers, deployed quickly, and strike where the enemy least expected. By the late 1930s, as Europe edged closer to war, Germany's U-boat fleet was expanding at an alarming pace. Though smaller than what Donitz desired, it represented a new generation of submarines, faster, more reliable, and capable of longer patrols. As Hitler's Reich prepared to plunge the world into war, the U-boat was no longer a forbidden weapon. It had become a dagger aimed at the very heart of Britain's survival. In the quiet docks of Kiel, Hamburg, and Wilhelmshaven, steel monsters were readied for a campaign that would terrorize the seas. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War erupted, the U-boat arm was not yet at full strength. Donitz, commanding the newly formed U-boat service, knew he needed hundreds of submarines to execute his vision of wolf-pack warfare. Instead, he began the war with barely 50 operational boats, many of them smaller coastal types. Yet these few vessels were unleashed immediately against British shipping, striking at the Atlantic lifeline in the war's opening months. The sinking of the passenger liner Athenia on September 3, 1939, the very day Britain declared war, foreshadowed the merciless campaign to come. The U-boats operated in the North Sea, the Atlantic, and even off the coast of France as the war expanded. While limited in numbers, their early successes validated Donitz's strategy. The mere presence of U-boats forced the Royal Navy to stretch its resources, escorting merchant convoys and patrolling vast waters. Already, the echoes of the First World War were returning, and Britain once again found itself under siege from beneath the waves. The stage was set for an undersea struggle that would grow into one of the defining battles of the entire war. The U-boat arm was unlike any other service in Hitler's war machine. Its men were volunteers, often young and highly motivated, trained to endure the claustrophobic, dangerous life aboard submarines. Their commanders were seen as elite warriors, daring hunters who challenged the might of the British Empire. Life aboard a U-boat was harsh, marked by stale air, cramped bunks, and constant danger of sudden death by depth charge or mechanical failure. Yet morale was high, fueled by nationalism and the belief that they were Germany's sharpest spear point. Dönitz instilled in his men a sense of brotherhood, the idea that each submarine was a pack wolf, part of a larger lethal family. The nickname Grey Wolves came to symbolize the ferocity and stealth of his U-boats. This combination of cutting-edge technology, tactical innovation, and human dedication gave the U-boat fleet an aura of menace unmatched by other branches of the German military. As their numbers slowly grew, so too did their confidence. By the dawn of the 1940s, the Atlantic was becoming a battlefield unlike any seen before, one where unseen hunters stalked their prey in deadly silence. Strategically, the U-boat was more than a ship. It was a weapon of psychological terror. Merchant sailors sailed, knowing they could vanish beneath the waves at any moment, torpedoed without warning in the dead of night. Insurance rates skyrocketed, and the fear of U-boat attack spread across the shipping industry. Newspapers carried stories of vessels disappearing without a trace, fueling anxiety among Allied civilians who relied on imports for daily life. Britain, an island nation, lived and died by its control of the seas, and the U-boat threatened that very foundation. Dönitz's vision was not just about sinking ships, but about creating fear, instability, and the sense that the Atlantic belonged to Germany. Every successful attack rippled far beyond the ocean, shaking governments, economies, and public morale. This was warfare not only of steel and torpedoes, but of nerves and endurance. The Wolfpack menace was only beginning, but even in its early stages, it forced the Allies to reconsider every assumption about naval supremacy. The U-boat was rewriting the rules of war, turning oceans into hunting grounds, where no convoy was ever safe. Thus, as the 1930s ended and the Second World War unfolded, the U-boat arm stood ready to play its fateful role. Born from the lessons of the First World War, refined in secrecy during the interwar years, and championed by the unrelenting vision of Karl Dönitz, the U-boat emerged as Hitler's chosen weapon of sea power. It was not the massive battleship that would define Germany's naval war, but the lean, deadly predator beneath the surface. In the years to come, U-boats would sink millions of tons of Allied shipping, shape grand strategy, and determine the very survival of nations. They would also suffer catastrophic losses, with entire crews vanishing into the deep in the most perilous service of the German military. But here, in the birth of this menace, the seeds were sown for a struggle unlike any other, a contest of stealth, endurance, and will across the endless oceans. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun, and the U-boat would be its most fearsome protagonist. In the silence of the depths, history's deadliest hunters waited. Karl Dönitz emerged from the ashes of the First World War as a man shaped by both defeat and conviction. Born in 1891, he had joined the Imperial German Navy with dreams of glory, but quickly found his destiny in the claustrophobic hulls of submarines. As a young officer, he commanded U-boats in the Mediterranean, experiencing firsthand the perils and potential of undersea warfare. Captured in 1918 after his boat was forced to the surface, he spent the end of the war as a prisoner, reflecting on the lessons of failure. For Dönitz, the greatest tragedy of the submarine campaign had not been the sinking of ships, but the lack of coordination that left individual boats isolated. He believed that if U-boats had operated in groups, striking together like a pack of wolves, they could have overwhelmed British convoys. This conviction became an obsession, something he carried with him into the interwar years, when Germany was forbidden to even build submarines. While many in the naval hierarchy still dreamed of great battleships, Dönitz quietly refined his vision of undersea warfare. He envisioned submarines not as lone hunters, but as coordinated predators, communicating, maneuvering, and striking in unison. He would call this doctrine the Rudel tactic, wolf pack tactics, and he believed it would strangle Britain's lifeline across the seas. The wolf pack concept was revolutionary because it transformed the U-boat from a solitary stalker into part of a synchronized lethal swarm. Dönitz imagined small groups of submarines patrolling vast stretches of ocean, using radio to report sightings of enemy convoys. Once contact was made, the first U-boat would shadow its prey, transmitting signals back to headquarters. Command would then direct nearby submarines to converge, silently positioning themselves along the convoy's route. When night fell, the pack would strike, surfacing among the merchant ships and unleashing torpedoes in coordinated waves. The chaos would be devastating. Escorts overwhelmed, communications jammed, and ships sinking in rapid succession. Dönitz compared it to wolves surrounding a herd, darting in from multiple sides until the prey was torn apart. This strategy relied on boldness, surprise, and above all coordination, something made possible by advances in radio technology and centralized command. Unlike surface fleets, submarines could not win through direct confrontation with naval armadas, but they could bleed Britain's lifeline dry, one convoy at a time, until the island was starved into submission. To implement his vision, Dönitz needed more than submarines. He needed a philosophy of war built on patience and psychological warfare. He understood that Britain, an island nation, was uniquely vulnerable to economic strangulation. Without imports of grain, oil, and raw materials, the nation's industries would falter and its people would starve. No amount of battleships could shield every merchant vessel crossing the vast Atlantic. Dönitz argued that submarines, cheap to build and numerous in potential, were the only realistic weapon capable of cutting Britain's arteries. But his vision was not universally accepted, even within the Kriegsmarine. Grand admirals still dreamed of decisive fleet battles, of massive battleships like the Bismarck dominating the seas. Dönitz, by contrast, saw the war as one of attrition, fought in the shadows of the deep, measured in tonnage sunk rather than ships defeated in battle. He reduced strategy to a simple equation. Britain imported 55 million tons of goods each year, and if U-boats could sink 700,000 tons per month, Britain would collapse. The wolf pack, he believed, was the weapon that could achieve this arithmetic of destruction. Central to Dönitz's doctrine was the idea of command and control, something rarely associated with submarines. In the First World War, U-boats had roamed independently, left to their commander's judgment. Dönitz broke from that tradition, insisting on centralized direction from a shore-based headquarters. He envisioned the U-boat arm as a single organism, its boats linked by radio to a central brain. Crews were trained not merely as hunters, but as disciplined parts of a larger machine. Each captain had initiative in attack, but their movements were coordinated to maximize collective power. This required reliable long-range radios, coded signals, and a constant stream of intelligence about Allied shipping routes. Dönitz insisted that every submarine commander understand his role in the pack, subordinating personal glory to collective success. In this way, he sought to turn the Atlantic into a chessboard, with convoys as pawns and U-boats as wolves, maneuvering for the kill. It was doctrine fused with technology, daring and relentless calculation. Dönitz's obsession with wolfpack tactics was matched only by his belief in the moral resolve of his submariners. He cultivated in them a sense of elite brotherhood, a conviction that they were the cutting edge of Germany's war effort. In speeches and training, he spoke of submariners as men chosen for their courage, endurance, and willingness to face death in confined steel coffins beneath the sea. Life aboard a U-boat was brutal: weeks without fresh air, limited food, constant damp, and the ever-present fear of depth charges. Yet Dönitz believed this crucible forged warriors of unmatched toughness. He reassured his men that their sacrifices were not just military, but civilizational, that without them Germany would lose the war. He encouraged commanders to embody both boldness and discipline, attacking with ferocity, yet never straying from coordinated tactics. In the mythology of the Kriegsmarine, the U-boat commander became a lone wolf within a larger pack, celebrated as a hero even as he submitted to central direction. This blend of independence and obedience mirrored Dönitz's personality itself: stubborn, visionary, but bound by his own rigid system. For him, wolf packs were not just strategy, they were destiny. Despite his clarity of vision, Dönitz faced obstacles in convincing the Nazi leadership to prioritize submarines. Hitler, enamored with grand projects, lavished resources on battleships, heavy cruisers, and prestige weapons. The Kriegsmarine's high command often viewed Dönitz's submarine program as a secondary effort, insufficient for decisive naval power. But Dönitz fought tirelessly, arguing that surface fleets would be hunted down by the Royal Navy, while U-boats could strike invisibly and relentlessly. He lobbied for hundreds of submarines, claiming that with 300 operational at once, Britain could be crushed within a year. He pointed to the vulnerabilities of Allied shipping, the thin escort forces, and the reliance on transatlantic supply lines. Even skeptics admitted that the idea had merit, but resources remained divided. Still, Dönitz never relented, using every success of his small U-boat fleet as proof of concept. By 1939, when war erupted, his wolfpack theory remained untested, but poised to dominate the coming struggle. In his mind, the submarine campaign was not merely an option, it was the key to Germany's ultimate victory. The genius of Dönitz lay not only in strategy, but in timing, for his vision emerged alongside critical technological advancements. Newer U-boats, like the Type 7 and Type 9, were more seaworthy, had greater range, and carried improved torpedoes. Radio communications had become more reliable, and encryption devices, like the Enigma machine, allowed secure coordination across vast distances. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft and agents provided intelligence on shipping routes, feeding into Donitz's central command system. Even as the Royal Navy remained the largest surface fleet in the world, it had not yet adapted fully to counter this new style of warfare. Convoy escorts were few, air cover over the Atlantic was limited, and merchant shipping travelled in predictable lanes. The Wolfpack strategy was perfectly suited to exploit these weaknesses. Dönitz recognized that the early years of the war would provide his best opportunity before Allied industry and technology could adjust. Every factor, from submarine design to intelligence networks, aligned with his vision. The Atlantic was about to become the proving ground for his ruthless doctrine of coordinated undersea warfare. Thus, Karl Dönitz stood at the edge of history as both visionary and predator, convinced that the Wolfpack would decide the fate of nations. He saw the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a battlefield, one where Britain's survival depended on fragile convoys stretching across thousands of miles. He reduced the war to a struggle of supply lines, a war of tonnage that could be won not by conquering territory, but by starving an empire. His vision was cold, calculated, and devoid of sentiment, but it was also brutally logical. For Dönitz, submarines were not auxiliary tools, but the decisive weapon of the modern age. He believed in a war of annihilation fought not in grand naval battles, but in silent ambushes, night attacks, and coordinated strikes beneath the waves. In his mind, Wolfpacks would be the wolves that devoured Britain's lifeblood. History would test this vision in the coming years, with victories that brought Britain to the brink of starvation and losses that consumed thousands of his own men. But here, in the vision of Karl Dönitz, the doctrine of the U-boat Wolfpacks was born. It would become one of the defining struggles of the Second World War. The rebirth of Germany's submarine arm in the 1930s was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, yet it unfolded in calculated secrecy and bold defiance. Officially, the Reich was forbidden from constructing U-boats, but German engineers and naval planners found ways to circumvent the restrictions. Submarine research was disguised under the pretense of civilian projects and foreign partnerships, particularly in countries like the Netherlands and Finland. Engineers worked quietly on prototype designs, testing hulls and engines that could later be mass-produced when political conditions allowed. By 1935, when Hitler openly repudiated the treaty, Germany revealed its first operational submarines in nearly 2 decades. This announcement shocked the world, but it came as no surprise to those who knew how determined the Reich had been to restore its undersea fleet. Almost overnight, shipyards across northern Germany, especially in Kiel and Hamburg, were mobilized for submarine construction. These yards became the forges of a new kind of naval war machine. Karl Dönitz, now commander of the U-boat arm, seized this moment to begin building the fleet he had long envisioned. Each keel laid down symbolized not only defiance of Versailles, but the preparation for an undersea war that would soon engulf the Atlantic. Central to the U-boat program was the Type 7 submarine, which became the workhorse of Germany's underwater fleet. Compact, versatile, and deadly, the Type 7 was designed to operate across the North Atlantic and patrol for weeks at a time. It carried up to 14 torpedoes and had a surface displacement of around 760 tons, making it smaller than many Allied destroyers yet surprisingly powerful. Its endurance, maneuverability, and ability to dive quickly made it an ideal predator against merchant convoys. Hundreds of Type 7s were produced, and they formed the backbone of Wolfpack operations throughout the war. Dönitz admired the design because it allowed him to field large numbers at relatively low cost, ensuring the mass deployment needed for his strategy of attrition. Crews lived in cramped, damp quarters where bunks were shared in shifts, but the boat's efficiency made these hardships tolerable. Each Type 7 was not just a submarine, It was a weapon of strategic terror designed to lurk invisibly across vital shipping lanes. By 1940, these boats became synonymous with the U-boat menace that haunted the Allied convoys. The Type 7 embodied Donitz's vision: quantity, stealth, and devastating impact. It was the true wolf of the wolf pack. While the Type 7 was the mainstay, the Kriegsmarine also developed the Type 9 submarine, a larger vessel designed for extended patrols. With nearly twice the displacement of the Type 7, the Type 9s could venture deep into the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, and even as far as the coastlines of Africa and the United States. It carried more torpedoes, up to 22, and had superior range, making it invaluable for long-distance operations. These boats were critical in Operation Drumbeat, the campaign against shipping along the American seaboard in 1942. The Type 9s could stalk targets thousands of miles from Europe, a capability that spread the U-boat war far beyond Britain's immediate supply lines. However, their larger size made them more vulnerable to detection, especially once Allied radar and patrol aircraft became effective. Still, they struck terror into the shipping lanes of the Western Hemisphere, proving that Germany's undersea reach was global. For Dönitz, the Type 9 represented strategic flexibility, a complement to the Type 7's mass deployment. It allowed him to project submarine warfare into waters once considered safe. These distant hunts showcased the audacity of the Kriegsmarine and underlined the far-reaching ambitions of the Wolfpack strategy. As the war dragged on, German engineers worked feverishly on a revolutionary design that promised to change the course of submarine warfare: the Type XXL electro-boot. Conceived in the later years of the war, it was a leap forward in technology, the first submarine designed to operate primarily underwater, rather than as a surface vessel that could submerge. With streamlined hulls, snorkel systems for air intake while submerged, and vastly improved battery capacity, the Type XXL could remain underwater for weeks, rendering older detection methods nearly useless. It could reach speeds of 17 knots submerged, making it faster below the surface than many Allied destroyers were above it. Had it entered service in significant numbers, it might have altered the balance in the Atlantic, perhaps prolonging the war. Yet its arrival came too late, in 1944-45, when Germany was already on the defensive and Allied control of the seas was overwhelming. Only a few Type XX ever conducted operational patrols before the surrender. Still, the design influenced post-war submarines in both East and West, laying the foundation for the nuclear-powered boats of the Cold War. The Type XXL was the ghost of a future that came too late for Germany, but it stood as a testament to the ambitions of Dönitz's fleet. Building a fleet of such magnitude required not only technical innovation but also massive industrial effort. Shipyards like Deutsche Werke in Kiel, AG Weser in Bremen, and Blohm and Voss in Hamburg became production centers that churned out U-boats in assembly line fashion. Workers labored around the clock, often under the threat of Allied bombing raids, to meet the ambitious targets set by the Kriegsmarine. German industry used prefabricated sections that were later welded together, a technique that sped up construction but sometimes led to quality issues. Thousands of laborers, including foreign forced workers and concentration camp prisoners, toiled under brutal conditions to keep production running. The regime viewed U-boats as essential to the war effort, so resources were funneled into the program even as other sectors of the economy suffered shortages. By 1943, over 1,000 U-boats had been built, a staggering number that testified to Germany's industrial mobilization. Yet quantity alone could not ensure success. The true strength of the fleet would depend on the men who sailed them. The yards delivered the steel hulls, but it was the sailors who gave them life, courage, and lethality on the high seas. Training U-boat crews was a rigorous process that demanded both technical skill and psychological endurance. Recruits underwent months of instruction in navigation, torpedo mechanics, engine maintenance, and gunnery. More importantly, they were tested for their ability to withstand the claustrophobic environment of life beneath the sea. The training schools in Neustadt, Pillau, and Flensburg became crucibles where men learned not only how to operate their boats, but also how to endure fear, exhaustion, and relentless pressure. Dönitz emphasized the creation of a brotherhood among his submariners, instilling a sense of pride and elitism. They were reminded constantly that they formed an elite corps, the spearhead of Germany's war against Britain. Crews practiced simulated convoy attacks, coordinated maneuvers, and silent running to evade detection. They trained in shallow waters, where mistakes meant disaster, building discipline through hardship. Only the most resilient were selected for command roles, with captains chosen for daring, decisiveness, and coolness under fire. This training forged men who could function in the suffocating environment of U-boat life, where survival depended on precision and nerve. Without such rigorous preparation, the Wolfpack vision could never have been realized. Life aboard a U-boat was brutally Spartan, a test of endurance as much as a mission of war. Space was so limited that sailors often shared bunks, sleeping in shifts while their comrades worked. The air grew foul within days, saturated with diesel fumes, body odor, and the ever-present dampness that corroded equipment and spirits alike. Fresh food quickly spoiled, leaving men to survive on canned goods and black bread. Condensation dripped constantly from the steel hull, soaking uniforms and bedding. Torpedoes were stored in the forward compartment, forcing men to live and sleep alongside their weapons. Privacy was non-existent, and nerves were frayed by the constant strain of being hunted by Allied escorts. Yet amid this hardship, camaraderie flourished, as crews bonded into tight-knit families bound by shared suffering. Dönitz encouraged this culture, believing it created resilience in the face of adversity. Each patrol was a gamble with death, but the men accepted it as their duty. The fleet was not just built of steel, it was built of human endurance. Thus, by the time war broke out in September 1939, Germany had forged a submarine force, both modern and formidable. Though still smaller than Dönitz had hoped, the U-boat fleet represented the culmination of years of secret planning, industrial expansion, and doctrinal innovation. The Type 7 and Night boats were ready to patrol the Atlantic, while visions of even more advanced designs loomed in the background. The shipyards hummed with production, turning out boats faster than ever before, and the training schools produced officers and sailors hardened for combat. In this fleet, Dönitz saw the embodiment of his Wolfpack vision, a force capable of striking terror into Britain's merchant lanes. The men and machines were now prepared for the test of fire. Each boat, each crew, carried the weight of Germany's hope for victory at sea, and as they slipped silently from their bases along the North Sea and Bay of Biscay, the Battle of the Atlantic was about to begin in earnest. The fleet was built, the wolves were ready, and the hunt was about to commence. When Germany plunged Europe into war in September 1939, the U-boat fleet was far smaller than Karl Dönitz had envisioned, yet it wasted no time in drawing blood. On September 3rd, just hours after Britain declared war, U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia off the coast of Ireland. Though a controversial target, the sinking signaled that the Atlantic would once again become a deadly battleground. Panic rippled through Britain, as civilians realized the war would reach far beyond the front lines. German crews celebrated their first kills, while London braced for a campaign that threatened food supplies and vital imports. Dönitz, however, knew that his fleet numbered fewer than 60 operational submarines, far too few for decisive impact. Yet he pressed forward, believing that aggression and audacity could compensate for lack of numbers. German U-boats fanned into the Atlantic, hunting lone merchant ships that still sailed without escort. It was the beginning of a new age of submarine warfare, where speed, stealth, and terror would dictate the rhythm of the seas. The early months of the war, often called the first happy time by U-boat crews, saw impressive successes against isolated ships. British shipping lanes were crowded with tankers, freighters, and liners, many of which still sailed independently rather than in convoys. The Admiralty, haunted by memories of World War I but slow to adapt, underestimated the scale of the threat. U-boats exploited this lack of organization, ambushing ships at night and vanishing beneath the waves before escorts could arrive. German submarine captains, many still young and untested, gained valuable combat experience. Each sinking was celebrated in Berlin as proof of the Reich's naval reach. Civilians across Britain soon faced rationing, as the loss of grain and fuel convoys created shortages. Families gathered around radios, anxious for news of attacks at sea, their lives suddenly tied to battles hundreds of miles away. The psychological shock was immense, reinforcing the notion that Britain's survival hung by the slender thread of merchant shipping. For Dönitz, every sinking was both a tactical blow and a strategic victory in his war of attrition. Among the early U-boat commanders, several names emerged as symbols of daring and ruthlessness. Kapitän-Leutnant Günther Prien became a legend in October 1939, when his submarine, U-47, penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow. In a daring nighttime raid, he torpedoed and sank the battleship Royal Oak, killing over 800 men. The feat electrified Germany and humiliated Britain, proving that no port was entirely safe from U-boat reach. Newspapers across Europe hailed Prien as the Bull of Scapa Flow, and his success inspired countless others in the Kriegsmarine. For Dönitz, the raid was a propaganda triumph that showcased both the tactical brilliance of his captains and the vulnerability of Britain's defences. The Royal Navy scrambled to reinforce its anchorages, suddenly aware of how porous its security had become. The raid also fueled Allied resolve, as Churchill declared that Britain must steel itself for a relentless undersea war. Scapa Flow was no longer invulnerable. It was a reminder that the German wolf packs were bold enough to strike at the very heart of Britain's naval pride. While daring raids captured headlines, the true battleground was the vast expanse of the Atlantic, where merchant shipping carried the lifeblood of Britain's war effort. U-boats prowled off-island, in the western approaches, and along the routes to Canada and the United States. Isolated tankers and freighters, especially those carrying oil or food, were prime targets. U-boats often surfaced after attacks, interrogating survivors or inspecting ships before finishing them with torpedoes or deck guns. These encounters were chilling for sailors who realized the sea itself had become a graveyard. German crews, hardened by the stress of patrols, learned how to conserve torpedoes, maneuver undetected, and escape depth-charge attacks. Each patrol was a crucible that tested both machinery and men, refining the Kriegsmarine's methods. Success bred confidence, and Dönitz's belief in the Wolfpack system grew stronger with every sinking. Yet beneath the triumph, he knew the Allies would not remain disorganized forever. The battle was still in its opening phase, a deadly chess game that would only grow more complex. The British response in 1939 and early 1940 revealed both resilience and hesitation. The Admiralty debated whether to return to the convoy system, which had been crucial in World War I, but was slow to implement this time. Independent sailings continued, leaving countless ships exposed. Escort vessels were in short supply, and destroyers were often pulled away for fleet operations instead of merchant protection. Churchill, newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, was one of the earliest advocates for tightening defences. He understood that Britain's fate was tied to food and fuel convoys across the Atlantic. Slowly convoys began to form, but gaps remained, especially in mid-ocean, where air cover could not reach. In these waters, U-boats hunted with near impunity, exploiting the so-called air gap. German captains prowled with growing boldness, knowing the Royal Navy's protective net was thin. The battle between offence and defence was still lopsided, and Britain's vulnerability was laid bare. The sinking of passenger liners added a cruel dimension to the U-boat war, as civilian deaths mounted in chilling numbers. In October 1939, U-boat attacks on ships like the Rawalpindi shocked the British public. While the Kriegsmarine insisted it targeted only legitimate vessels of war, the line between combatant and civilian often blurred. U-boat captains were instructed to obey prize rules when possible, but Dönitz increasingly urged his men to prioritize results over restraint. The brutal logic of attrition dictated that every ship sunk weakened Britain's survival. For Allied sailors, it meant every voyage across the Atlantic carried the shadow of death. Families in Britain and across the Commonwealth received telegrams of loss, while newspapers printed grim casualty lists. The sea became a theatre not just of naval combat, but of human tragedy on an industrial scale. In Berlin, each sinking was reported with cold statistics, but for those at sea, it was survival or annihilation. These early raids set the tone for a campaign that would grow ever more ruthless. The winter of 1939-40 brought new challenges as the North Atlantic turned into a frigid hellscape of storms and darkness. For U-boat crews, rough seas meant constant flooding, icy condensation, and the bone-numbing cold of unheated compartments. Yet bad weather also cloaked their movements, giving them chances to strike when Allied escorts were blind. Merchant crews faced even greater hardships, struggling to keep convoys together in towering waves. Many ships were lost not to torpedoes but to storms, yet the U-boat menace magnified their peril. The Germans exploited these conditions, honing tactics of night surface attacks when escorts least expected them. These engagements taught Dönitz's captains valuable lessons about patience, timing, and stealth. It was a period of experimentation where each patrol revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities. The early raids thus became the laboratory in which modern submarine warfare was forged, and with each sinking, Britain edged closer to the brink of desperation. By the spring of 1940, the early phase of the U-boat campaign had demonstrated both promise and limitation. German submarines had inflicted serious damage, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. Yet the Kriegsmarine still lacked the numbers to fully strangle Britain's supply routes. The Wolfpack strategy remained largely theoretical, as there were seldom enough boats at sea to form coordinated groups. Britain, meanwhile, began adapting, slowly expanding the convoy system and mobilizing escorts. The struggle had entered a stage of escalation, where both sides refined their doctrines for the greater battles to come. For U-boat crews, the early raids were a baptism of fire, proving their courage and testing their endurance. For the Allies, it was a wake-up call that the Atlantic was once again the front line of survival. The clash between merchant convoys and prowling wolves would define the years ahead, and as 1940 unfolded, the Battle of the Atlantic was only just beginning its deadly crescendo. The Wolfpack tactic, or Rudel tactic as Karl Donitz called it, emerged as the cornerstone of Germany's submarine strategy during World War II. Unlike World War I, when U-boats often operated independently, the new method sought to overwhelm convoys through concentrated and coordinated strikes. The idea was simple in theory, but revolutionary in practice. Multiple submarines, dispersed over a wide area, would be directed to converge on a target once one U-boat made contact. This transformed the Atlantic into a hunting ground where the first sighting acted like a signal flare for an entire pack. At its core, the Wolfpack system relied heavily on communication, discipline and timing. The lone submarine no longer acted in isolation, but became the eyes of a much larger predator. Donitz understood that Britain's survival depended on convoys, so destroying them required coordinated power. His strategy envisioned dozens of submarines striking in waves at night, overwhelming escorts and slaughtering merchants. To the Allied sailors, these coordinated attacks felt like being set upon by predators in the dark. The Wolfpack made the Atlantic a theater of terror, where every horizon could hide multiple enemies. In the chess game of the sea, the Germans had created their deadliest piece. The mechanics of the Wolfpack depended on the careful use of long-range radio communication. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed it at a safe distance, often trailing for hours or even days. During this time, the commander sent encrypted messages to U-boat headquarters, reporting the convoy's position, speed, and course. Donitz's staff in occupied France then directed nearby submarines to intercept. The reporting boat played the most dangerous role, often enduring depth charge attacks as it stayed close enough to track the enemy. Once reinforcements arrived, the pack would assemble along the convoy's route, ready to launch simultaneous strikes. This coordination gave German submarines the element of surprise, as a seemingly lone attacker was soon joined by half a dozen others. The Admiralty, initially unaware of this system, often underestimated the scale of attacks until it was too late. To Allied sailors, the sudden appearance of multiple torpedo tracks in the water was terrifying proof that they were not facing a single submarine. Radio discipline, however, was both the Wolfpack's strength and its Achilles heel, for transmissions also betrayed positions to Allied direction finding. Nevertheless, in the early years, the method worked with devastating effectiveness. Night surface attacks were the most feared element of Wolfpack operations, turning the cover of darkness into a deadly weapon. U-boats, designed to operate submerged, were actually faster and more maneuverable on the surface. Donitz instructed his captains to treat night as their ally, allowing them to charge directly into convoys undetected. By keeping low profiles, the submarines blended with the sea's horizon, making them nearly invisible until it was too late. Under cover of night, U-boats could fire torpedoes at close range, strike multiple targets, and then weave through panicked merchant vessels. The confusion was immense, as escorts struggled to distinguish friend from foe in the dark chaos. Torpedo detonations ripped ships apart, while crews scrambled to lifeboats or fought fires. Each submarine operated semi-independently within the pack, exploiting gaps in the convoy's defense. Some captains even used deck guns to finish stragglers, conserving torpedoes for more valuable targets. For Allied sailors, the blackened Atlantic became a nightmare realm where invisible predators stalked them at will. The Wolfpack's night strikes became a signature of German naval terror, unmatched in its psychological impact. The Wolfpack tactic demanded not only technical skill, but also psychological resilience from U-boat crews. Long hours of shadowing convoys without being detected created unbearable tension. Men endured silence, fatigue, and the constant fear that the enemy might spot them first. When the order to attack finally came, adrenaline surged, and every crewman knew survival hinged on precision. Inside the cramped pressure hull, the sounds of engines, torpedo launches, and explosions outside created an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Captains had to balance aggression with caution, knowing that escorts with sonar and depth charges were waiting for mistakes. For sailors in the convoy, the stress was equally intense, as flares lit the night sky and emergency signals echoed through the fleet. Every hour brought uncertainty. Would the next explosion strike their vessel? Survivors often described these battles as nightmares of fire and steel, punctuated by screams in the dark. The wolf pack did not merely sink ships, it shattered the morale of merchant sailors and escort crews alike. For Donitz, this psychological dominance was as valuable as tonnage sunk. Fear itself became a weapon in the arsenal of the pack. At the heart of Wolfpack success was the mathematics of attrition. A single U-boat might sink one or two ships before being driven off, but a coordinated pack could cripple an entire convoy. With multiple submarines firing in quick succession, escorts found themselves overwhelmed. Destroyers and corvettes raced between attacks, their depth charges expended faster than they could reload. Merchant captains, forced to zigzag in panic, broke formation, creating easy targets. This cascading chaos magnified the pack's effectiveness far beyond the sum of its parts. Donitz calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of shipping per month would strangle Britain into submission. In 1941 and early 1942, wolf packs often came close to achieving these targets, sinking merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Insurance rates soared, and the morale of sailors plummeted. The wolf pack was not simply a tactic, it was a calculated system of economic warfare. Britain's survival, quite literally, depended on plugging the gaps in this deadly equation. Yet the wolf pack system carried inherent risks, especially with its reliance on radio transmissions. Allied intelligence quickly developed high-frequency direction finding, or HUFDUF, which could triangulate U-boat messages. The very coordination that made wolf packs effective also made them vulnerable to detection. Escort commanders soon learned to anticipate attacks once they intercepted German signals. While Donitz's encrypted Enigma messages initially offered protection, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were making steady progress. This growing intelligence war meant that the Wolfpack system could no longer operate in complete secrecy. U-boat commanders began to face ambushes, as escorts preemptively struck gathering packs. Still, during the height of the campaign, the system inflicted staggering damage before the Allies adapted. The battle became one of cat and mouse, with every advance in German tactics matched by Allied countermeasures. In this duel, the Wolfpack's brilliance was both its greatest strength and its eventual downfall. The scale of Wolfpack battles shocked the world, often producing engagements that lasted for days. Convoys such as SC-7 and HX-79 in October 1940 suffered devastating losses when multiple packs struck in succession. More than 30 ships were lost in just a few days, crippling Britain's supply lines. Survivors described scenes of burning tankers, cargo ships breaking apart, and lifeboats scattered across oil-slick seas. For U-boat crews, these victories validated Donitz's vision and fueled the myth of the Atlantic Wolves. German propaganda seized on these triumphs, portraying submariners as modern knights of the sea. The Allies, however, saw them as ruthless predators, sinking ships without mercy or regard for human life. These contrasting narratives shaped the psychological war, with German morale soaring while Britain's resolve was tested. Each battle was a clash of endurance, where technology, training, and raw human will decided survival. The Wolfpack had proven it could dominate the seas, but its dominance would not go unchallenged. By the end of 1940, the Wolfpack tactic had firmly established itself as the most effective weapon in Germany's naval arsenal. Its blend of coordination, deception, and concentrated violence threatened to sever Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Yet even as Donitz celebrated successes, the Allies were already learning, adapting, and preparing countermeasures. Convoys began sailing with more escorts, long-range patrol aircraft expanded coverage, and intelligence breakthroughs shifted the balance. The Wolfpack's reign of terror would reach its peak in the coming years, but its vulnerabilities were already exposed. Still, in the early phase, it seemed unstoppable, sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Merchant sailors whispered about the wolves in the night, a phrase that captured both fear and inevitability. Every voyage across the Atlantic became a gamble against unseen hunters. For Donitz, the tactic was a masterpiece of naval innovation, one that briefly gave Germany the upper hand. In the story of the Atlantic War, the Wolfpack became both legend and nightmare, forever etched into history as the embodiment of undersea warfare. Between the summer of 1940 and the early months of 1941, German U-boats entered what became known as the erste glückliche Zeit, the first happy time. This was the period when the Royal Navy was still reeling from the fall of France and the collapse of Norway, leaving vast stretches of the Atlantic vulnerable. With French Atlantic ports like Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle now under German control, U-boats could operate far deeper into the ocean with reduced transit time. The Allied convoy system was still in its infancy, stretched thin by too few escorts and little air cover. Donitz had fewer than 30 operational U-boats at the time, but their impact was disproportionately destructive. Merchant ships, many sailing unescorted, became easy prey for lone U-boats or small packs working the Atlantic lanes. The seas west of Ireland and along the British Isles became graveyards for tankers and freighters carrying lifelines of oil, food, and arms. Britain, utterly dependent on imports, found its survival threatened by a predator that seemed unstoppable. The collapse of France meant the German submariners could strike at will, operating from secure bases with direct access to the Atlantic. These ports became the beating heart of U-boat operations, enabling faster turnarounds and longer patrols. The happy time was not simply a German success, it was an Allied nightmare, one that revealed the fragility of Britain's survival at sea. The statistics of this period underline the scale of devastation. In the last 6 months of 1940 alone, more than 1.6 million tons of Allied shipping was sent to the bottom. Convoy escorts were few and poorly coordinated, while radar and sonar technology was still primitive. Many ships sailed independently, hoping speed or luck would spare them, but such isolation made them easy targets. U-boat commanders like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became household names in Germany, celebrated as naval heroes. Kretschmer perfected the tactic of firing torpedoes at close range on the surface at night, often sinking several ships in a single patrol. Schepke's boldness saw him rack up sinkings with ferocity, while Prien, already famous for his daring raid on Scapa Flow, continued his exploits across the Atlantic. German propaganda seized upon these successes, elevating U-boat aces to the status of modern knights of the sea. For Britain, however, these names became symbols of terror, associated with sudden explosions in the night, and convoys torn apart. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, sailors' morale faltered, and food shortages began to loom as imports dwindled. Each convoy that limped into Liverpool or Glasgow carried survivors with haunted eyes and stories of infernal nights on the Atlantic. This combination of raw statistics and human suffering gave the happy time its grim significance. The tactics employed during this era showcased the ruthless efficiency of the Wolfpack system. U-boats patrolled in patrol lines, spread across hundreds of miles, waiting for a sighting. Once contact was made, they shadowed the convoy and summoned reinforcements. Night surface attacks became the trademark of the period, with submarines weaving into convoys and firing spreads of torpedoes. Escorts, often limited to a handful of destroyers or corvettes, were overwhelmed by the number of attackers. Merchant ships, lacking speed and protection, were left to burn or sink in the darkness. Survivors clung to lifeboats or rafts in freezing waters, often watching helplessly as other ships were struck one after another. The Germans called it a hunting tactic, but to the Allies it resembled butchery. By using stealth, surprise, and superior coordination, U-boat crews inflicted damage that far exceeded their numbers. The convoys that did survive often arrived, scattered and reduced, their cargoes diminished, and their crews traumatized. This brutal efficiency convinced Dönitz that his vision of strangling Britain through tonnage war was within reach. For the men on the receiving end, however, the Atlantic had become a nightmare with no dawn. The terror of the happy time was not confined to statistics or tactics. It was also deeply psychological. Merchant sailors, many of them civilians with little training, faced an enemy that struck unseen from beneath the waves or in the darkness. The constant threat of torpedo attack made every hour of every voyage a test of nerves. Crews slept in their clothes, ready to abandon ship at any moment. Lifeboat drills became grim rehearsals for what most believed was inevitable. Survivors often described the shriek of torpedoes or the thunder of explosions as sounds they could never forget. The knowledge that the U-boats operated with impunity, slipping away after each attack, bred despair. Letters from sailors' families reflected growing fear, as news of losses dominated headlines. Britain, standing alone after the fall of France, seemed on the edge of starvation. This atmosphere of dread was part of Dönitz's plan, for the war on morale was as important as the war on tonnage. The happy time was not merely a military campaign, it was psychological warfare on a continental scale. German commanders were acutely aware of the symbolic weight of their victories. Each ton of shipping sunk was calculated in terms of Britain's ability to sustain its war effort. Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto for his strict radio discipline, achieved over 200,000 tons sunk in a matter of months. Schepke, flamboyant and daring, used his charisma to boost morale at home while terrorizing the seas abroad. Prien continued his deadly efficiency, building on his legend as the Bull of Scapa Flow. Together these men became symbols of the U-boat arm, their successes turning them into figures of fascination and envy within Germany. Dönitz himself encouraged this culture of U-boat aces, understanding that morale at home was bolstered by tales of triumph at sea. German newspapers ran front-page stories of sinkings, and newsreels depicted submariners as fearless warriors. In reality, the victories came at the cost of sleepless nights, constant danger, and the knowledge that any patrol could be their last. Yet during the happy time, the aura of invincibility surrounded them. To the Allies, these commanders were predators. To the Germans, they were national heroes. Britain's response during this period was hampered by technological and logistical shortcomings. Radar had not yet been refined to detect low-profile submarines on the surface. Sonar, or ATSTIC, had limited range and effectiveness, especially when submarines attacked from within convoys. Air cover over the mid-Atlantic gap was virtually non-existent, leaving convoys vulnerable once they moved beyond land-based aircraft range. Escorts were too few to protect the growing number of convoys needed to sustain Britain. The US, not yet in the war, had not fully committed its resources, leaving the Royal Navy to fight largely alone. Shipyards were struggling to replace losses, with new Liberty ships still months away from rolling off American assembly lines. The gap between sinkings and replacements widened alarmingly, creating fears of outright collapse. Churchill himself later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. In these months it seemed as if Germany had found a weapon that could force Britain to its knees. The happy time thus represented the height of U-boat power and the depth of Britain's vulnerability. The geography of the campaign also favoured the U-boats during this phase. With bases in France, submarines could patrol the western approaches, the Bay of Biscay, and the shipping lanes around the British Isles with ease. Shorter transit times meant more patrols, more attacks, and greater efficiency. The narrow waters around Ireland and Western Britain funneled convoys into predictable routes, ideal for interception. The weather, often stormy and dark, gave submarines natural cover to operate undetected. The shallow coastal waters also complicated escort maneuvers, making depth charges less effective. Merchant traffic remained heavy as Britain imported vital food, oil, and military supplies from across the Atlantic. Each of these factors created a deadly environment where submarines thrived. To U-boat commanders, the seas were filled with opportunities, convoys appearing like herds of prey crossing a predator's territory. The strategic balance leaned heavily in Germany's favor, giving the impression of an unstoppable campaign. Geography, weather, and timing combined to make the happy time what it was, the zenith of U-boat dominance. Yet even during this golden era of success, seeds of change were already being planted. Allied scientists were improving radar, refining sonar, and developing new tactics for convoy defense. The United States was edging closer to war, providing escorts and resources that would eventually shift the balance. Merchant ship production was accelerating, preparing to replace losses at a rate that Germany could not sustain. The Royal Navy was learning hard lessons, and each convoy, even in defeat, brought experience that would be applied in future battles. For the U-boat crews, however, these developments were invisible. All they saw was victory. In their logbooks, sinkings mounted, patrols were celebrated, and promotions followed. Germany believed it had discovered the weapon that could win the war at sea. The happy time, therefore, stands as both triumph and illusion, an era when the Atlantic belonged to the U-boats, but only briefly. In the coming years, this dominance would be tested, eroded, and eventually reversed. For now, though, the seas echoed with explosions, fires, and the cries of men adrift, testament to the terror of the wolves. Life aboard a German U-boat during World War II was a paradox of power and vulnerability. These vessels carried the potential to cripple nations, yet their crews lived in conditions that were cramped, foul, and perpetually dangerous. A Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the fleet, measured only 220 feet in length, with just enough space for its 40 to 50 men to squeeze past one another in narrow corridors. Every inch of space was accounted for. Torpedoes stacked under bunks, food crammed into every available nook, and machinery humming in suffocating proximity. Fresh provisions hung from pipes, bread growing mouldy within days, and potatoes stored in bilges until the sea itself began to rot them. The air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the acrid stench of unwashed bodies. Privacy did not exist. Men shared bunks in shifts, sleeping above torpedoes or beside noisy engines. Fresh water was rationed so strictly that shaving and bathing were rare luxuries, leaving salt-encrusted skin and itching beards as the norm. The temperature could swing wildly, freezing in the North Atlantic, sweltering in the Bay of Biscay, stifling in tropical waters. In this environment, physical discomfort was constant, but psychological strain was the true burden. The U-boat was at once a weapon and a coffin, carrying men who hunted others while constantly hunted themselves. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by the endless watch schedule. Crews rotated through shifts of 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off, a cycle that blurred the line between night and day beneath the sea. Sleep was fractured and shallow, disturbed by alarms, depth charges, or the grinding sounds of machinery. Meals, when taken, were hurried affairs, eaten in the mess while feet and shoulders brushed against passing shipmates. The cook, often working with the simplest of ingredients, became one of the most important figures on board, his meals providing fleeting comfort amid the tension. Music from a harmonica, a deck of cards, or a shared cigarette offered moments of escape from the gnawing fear of detection. Yet even in these small reprieves, men knew the odds stacked against them. By 1943, fewer than 1 in 3 U-boat sailors would return home alive. Discipline was enforced by routine, with constant drills, maintenance tasks, and torpedo checks keeping minds focused. Letters from home were rare, censored, and often weeks out of date, adding to the sense of isolation. The crew's world was reduced to steel walls, dim lights, and the endless expanse of the ocean outside. Their existence was that of predators constantly aware of their own fragility. When a U-boat prepared to attack, tension reached a fever pitch. Men were ordered to silence, every unnecessary sound forbidden, as the submarine stalked its prey. The boat would surface under the cover of darkness, diesel engines roaring briefly before throttling down to stealthy electric motors. The periscope became the captain's eye, peering above the waves to mark the convoy's course. Orders were whispered as torpedo tubes were flooded and armed, each man acutely aware that a miscalculation meant death for them all. The firing of torpedoes was a moment of release. Compressed air hissing, the weapons sliding into the ocean, followed by silence as all waited for impact. Seconds stretched into eternity until explosions confirmed a hit, a cheer quickly muted in fear of revealing their position. Yet triumph was fleeting, for with every sinking came retaliation. Escorts pounced, dropping depth charges with merciless precision, turning the hunter into the hunted in an instant. The U-boat crew braced themselves as steel groaned and rivets strained under the underwater blasts. Every attack was a dance with death, one that tested not only machinery, but also human nerves. It was in these moments that the duality of life aboard a U-boat revealed itself most starkly. Depth charge attacks were the ultimate nightmare of the submariner. As soon as explosions erupted, the captain ordered a crash dive, sending the boat plunging beneath the surface. The deeper they went, the greater the pressure, water creaking against the hull like an immense vice. Men clung to pipes and machinery as the boat shuddered under detonations, light bulbs flickering or shattering with each concussive wave. The smell of diesel mixed with sweat and fear as batteries strained to keep the boat alive in suffocating silence. Air grew stale and humid, oxygen levels dropping as carbon dioxide rose, choking lungs and fogging minds. Sweat rolled down faces, but no one dared move or speak louder than a whisper. Each depth charge was felt like a hammer on steel, reverberating through bones and nerves alike. The sound of rivets snapping or water seeping in could trigger panic, but discipline was essential to survival. Men waited in unbearable stillness, listening to the pings of sonar like the footsteps of hunters above. When explosions finally ceased, the relief was temporary. At any moment, another barrage could follow. For the crew, survival often depended on both luck and the restraint of their enemies. Psychologically, the strain of constant danger gnawed at even the most hardened men. The isolation of the ocean, coupled with weeks or months without sight of land, created a sense of timelessness. Fear of a sudden, unseen death made sleep shallow and dreams haunted. Some men confessed that the anticipation of being hunted was worse than battle itself. The endless waiting, knowing that detection meant a fight for life. Silence was oppressive. Even the creak of steel or a cough could feel like betrayal. Claustrophobia gnawed at nerves, with no escape from the same faces, smells and sounds day after day. Sailors joked grimly about iron coffins, a nickname that carried truth as U-boat losses mounted. Yet camaraderie formed under these conditions, bonds of shared suffering that bound crews together. The captain's role was not just tactical but psychological, holding men together when despair threatened to break them. Religious tokens, letters from home, or small rituals became anchors of sanity in a world dominated by fear. The psychology of undersea warfare was a battle as relentless as the fight against convoys. For every torpedo fired, there was also a silent war within the human mind. Despite the misery, many U-boat men felt pride in their role as Germany's front-line warriors. They were celebrated as an elite branch of the Kriegsmarine, their service seen as both dangerous and glamorous. Awards like the Iron Cross or Knight's Cross were frequently bestowed upon successful captains, making them celebrities in Nazi Germany. Sailors wrote home with pride, often omitting the hardships they endured to maintain morale among families. Propaganda painted them as fearless hunters, stalking the seas with cold efficiency. In reality, the crews knew they were vulnerable, especially as Allied technology advanced. Yet pride became a shield against despair, fueling their determination to fight on. Many were motivated by loyalty to comrades rather than ideology, unwilling to let their fellow sailors down. The U-boat community was small, and news of lost boats traveled quickly, each sinking felt personally by survivors on land or sea. Songs, traditions, and the iconic U-boat badge gave them a sense of belonging and identity. Even in defeat, submariners clung to their image as the grey wolves of the Atlantic. For them, honor and survival were inseparable, bound together in the depths. The ocean itself was both ally and enemy. Its vastness provided concealment, allowing submarines to slip away undetected into the endless horizon. Yet it was unforgiving, with storms battering fragile vessels and saltwater corroding equipment. In winter, ice formed on decks and periscopes, making even basic operations treacherous. Waves crashed over men standing watch, threatening to sweep them into the freezing abyss. In tropical patrols, heat was suffocating, with temperatures inside the boat rising above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat-drenched bodies, and air turned so foul that sailors joked they could cut it with a knife. Supplies spoiled quickly, leaving meals monotonous and often revolting. Rats, mold, and cockroaches became unwelcome companions, thriving in the cramped and unsanitary quarters. Every patrol was a gamble against not just the enemy, but also the ocean itself. The unpredictability of nature was a constant reminder that they were intruders in a hostile world. For U-boat sailors, the sea was both battlefield and executioner. To survive as hunters constantly at risk of becoming prey required resilience beyond measure. Every patrol demanded men balance the thrill of sinking ships with the terror of detection. Victories were celebrated quietly, for they knew retribution followed every success. The hunted became hunters, and hunters became hunted in an endless cycle of attack and evasion. The experience left scars. Many survivors later spoke of nightmares, trembling at the sound of thunder or the slam of a door. Yet during the war, there was no time to dwell on trauma. Duty demanded focus and discipline. U-boat life was defined by extremes: camaraderie and claustrophobia, pride and despair, triumph and terror. In this crucible, men were forged into warriors of the deep, their lives measured in tons of shipping sunk or depth charges endured. They operated in shadows, unseen but feared, shaping the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. To be aboard a U-boat was to live with death as a constant companion, every dive a step into uncertainty. The happy time revealed their power, but life beneath the waves revealed their fragility. In the end, they were both hunters and the hunted, trapped in an unforgiving war beneath the sea. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the world's attention turned to the Pacific, but for Karl Donitz, the commander of Germany's U-boat arm, the attack represented something different, a new battlefield opening across the Atlantic. With the United States now officially at war, the German Navy saw the American eastern seaboard as a ripe hunting ground, poorly defended and brimming with merchant traffic. Donitz launched what became known as Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat, sending his most experienced U-boat captains westward. These men were veterans of the North Atlantic, skilled in convoy attacks, and eager for the opportunity to strike at a fresh, unprepared enemy. The United States, though industrially powerful, had not yet fortified its coastal defenses and had underestimated the immediate danger posed by U-boats. Ships steamed brightly lit at night, with coastal cities glowing in the background, turning merchant vessels into silhouetted targets. For U-boat commanders, it was almost surreal, a shooting gallery where torpedoes rarely missed. The first wave of 5 submarines left Germany in late December 1941, slipping past Allied patrols and heading for the rich shipping lanes off the American coast. Their mission was to unleash terror, sink tonnage, and cripple American logistics before the enemy could respond. Thus began what U-boat sailors called the Second Happy Time, a period of success rivaling their earlier dominance in European waters. The U-boats arrived off the American East Coast in January 1942, and the results were immediate and devastating. Within days, oil tankers, freighters, and passenger liners were burning off Cape Hatteras and Long Island, their fires lighting up the horizon. The Americans had made critical mistakes. They had not enforced blackouts in coastal cities, leaving harbors and skylines blazing like beacons. Merchant ships sailed independently instead of in protected convoys, ignoring the hard-earned lessons Britain had learned under fire. This lack of coordination allowed U-boat captains to sit offshore, tracking one ship after another as they moved along the coast. Torpedoes struck with deadly accuracy, sending vessels to the bottom, often within sight of beachgoers. Newspapers reported the burning wrecks visible from boardwalks, and ordinary citizens could smell the oil slicks washing ashore. In just the first month, the handful of U-boats dispatched for Drumbeat had sunk over 150,000 tons of shipping. German commanders celebrated the operation as a triumph of surprise and daring, confirming Donitz's vision that the U-boat fleet could bring even America to its knees. The psychological shock was as great as the material loss, for the U-boats seemed to appear everywhere, striking with impunity. The stage was set for one of the most destructive phases of the Atlantic War. The success of Operation Drumbeat encouraged Dönitz to send more submarines across the ocean. Soon, wolf packs roamed from Newfoundland to the Gulf of Mexico, attacking shipping in waters Americans had believed safe. Tankers carrying oil from Texas were sunk just outside port entrances, flames spreading across the sea like floating infernos. Off the east coast, ships laden with war material for Britain were struck down within miles of departure, leaving crews scrambling for lifeboats in icy winter waters. The U-boat captains exploited every weakness, operating with precision and ruthlessness. Their radio messages back to Germany painted a picture of opportunity, calling the campaign the greatest harvest. By spring of 1942, more than 70 U-boats had entered American waters, sinking hundreds of vessels. In New Orleans, Jacksonville, and even within Chesapeake Bay, explosions rocked the shipping lanes, spreading panic among sailors. German sailors nicknamed the American coast the American shooting range, mocking the unpreparedness of their enemy. For Dönitz, this was the vindication of years of planning. The wolf packs had extended their reach to the New World. The happy time was reborn, and its scale was staggering. Life aboard the U-boats during this campaign mirrored the intensity of their success. Crews worked tirelessly, loading torpedoes, manning periscopes, and keeping machinery in order for near-constant attacks. Each sinking was followed by the same grim routine, surfacing to recharge batteries, scanning the seas for survivors, and preparing for the next target. For sailors on merchant ships, the terror was palpable, as U-boats could strike at any hour, from beneath waves invisible to the naked eye. Survivors' accounts describe the horror of seeing their shipmates swallowed by flames or drowning in oil-covered waters. Radio operators broadcast distress calls frantically, only for escorts to arrive too late. At times, U-boats shadowed convoys for days, waiting until nightfall to pounce with coordinated strikes. This campaign forced Allied sailors to sleep in their clothes, boots by their bunks, ready to abandon ship at a moment's notice. The ocean had become a graveyard, filled with wrecks and oil slicks stretching for miles. To the men of the Kriegsmarine, this was proof of German superiority at sea, but to the Allies it was a wake-up call. The myth of American invulnerability had been shattered. The human element of this phase revealed stark contrasts between predator and prey. German crews lived in squalor and constant fear of counterattack, yet they were sustained by adrenaline and propaganda broadcasts celebrating their victories. Each tonnage report published in Berlin was a boost to morale, showing the U-boat arm as the Reich's spearhead against Allied logistics. For the sailors of the merchant fleet, however, each voyage became a gamble with death. Civilians, many of them untrained, were pressed into service to keep supplies flowing, often with little protection beyond hope. Families at home read casualty lists daily, as more than 600 ships would be sunk off American waters in 1942 alone. Survivors often recounted the feeling of helplessness, seeing a torpedo's wake streaking toward them without any chance to evade. Coastal towns grew familiar with funerals, oil-soaked bodies, and lifeboats washing ashore. For Americans, the war had arrived not in distant Europe, but at their very doorstep. The contrast between German triumph and Allied suffering defined this phase of the campaign. It was a war without front lines, fought in silence beneath the waves. Yet the seeds of German overreach were already present. As the campaign expanded, U-boats stretched their supply lines, forcing them to operate far from bases in France. Long patrols meant greater wear on machinery, exhausted crews, and dwindling supplies of torpedoes and fuel. The reliance on radio transmissions for coordination also exposed them to Allied interception. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had already begun deciphering parts of the Enigma system, giving the Allies an edge in predicting U-boat movements. By mid-1942, the United States had learned hard lessons, implementing convoys along the coast and deploying aircraft to patrol vulnerable waters. Blackouts were enforced in coastal cities, dimming the beacons that had once guided U-boat attacks. Escort ships bristled with depth charges, sonar systems and radar that made hunting far more dangerous. The days of easy pickings were coming to an end, though the price of delay had been immense. German crews noticed the shift quickly as sinkings became harder to achieve and losses began to mount. What had begun as a slaughter was slowly turning into a contest. Still, in the early months, the tonnage sunk was staggering, and Berlin celebrated these victories with fanfare. Hitler praised the U-boat fleet as the Reich's most effective weapon, convinced that Britain and America could be brought to starvation through maritime strangulation. Dönitz, however, remained cautious, knowing that numbers mattered more than individual triumphs. He lobbied tirelessly for more submarines, arguing that only a fleet of 300 operational U-boats could truly bring down Allied shipping. Yet Germany's industrial capacity was stretched thin, producing too few boats to sustain dominance. Meanwhile, America's shipyards began turning out Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The mathematical balance of war was shifting, but in the spring of 1942, that reality was not yet apparent to the sailors at sea. For them, each patrol was judged by the number of ships destroyed and the tonnage reported. Captains like Reinhard Hardigan and Eric Topp became legends, their names synonymous with daring raids on the American coast. Newspapers in Germany hailed them as heroes, while American headlines told of tragedy and disaster. This dual narrative underscored how perception shaped the memory of this campaign. By the summer of 1942, the second happy time began to fade as Allied defenses improved, and U-boats faced escalating risks. Aircraft patrols closed the gaps once exploited, and convoys turned the American coast into a fortress at sea. Still, the damage had been done. Nearly 3 million tons of Allied shipping had been lost in just 6 months. The expansion of the battle had revealed the reach of German U-boats, but it also exposed their limitations. No longer could they operate with impunity, for the Allies had adapted, turning technology and industry into decisive advantages. For U-boat crews, the early triumphs gave way to brutal attrition, each patrol becoming a fight for survival. The ocean that had once seemed theirs to dominate became a gauntlet of aircraft, sonar pings, and depth charges. Yet in those first chaotic months after Pearl Harbor, the wolf packs had proven their power, striking fear into the richest nation on Earth. The expansion to the American coast was a high point of audacity in the U-boat war. It was also the beginning of the slow decline, for the hunters' dominance was about to be reversed. In the Battle of the Atlantic, fortune favored not only courage but also endurance. The early years of the U-boat war exposed the fragility of unescorted shipping, and by 1941, the Allies had begun to refine the convoy system into a lifeline of survival. Convoys gathered merchant ships into tight formations, sometimes more than 50 vessels in a single group, guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers. The logic was simple yet powerful. Many ships together with protection were far harder to sink than isolated, vulnerable freighters. The British Admiralty, drawing lessons from the First World War, recognized that coordination was as vital as firepower. Naval bases from Halifax to Liverpool became centers of planning, where convoys were assembled under strict timetables. Each convoy was assigned escorts, sometimes too few, but always better than none, and officers drilled endlessly in anti-submarine tactics. The escorts formed a protective ring around the convoy, moving swiftly to chase sonar contacts, while the merchantmen steamed steadily onward. Communication between ships was limited to signals, avoiding radio transmissions that might reveal their position to lurking U-boats. To the sailors, life in a convoy was tense but strangely reassuring, knowing they were not alone in the vast ocean. The sea lanes became highways of war, guarded by steel sentinels against the undersea menace. For the Allies, convoys were more than strategy, they were survival incarnate. At the heart of the convoy system were the escorts, often small and hastily built ships that carried enormous responsibility. The British Flower-class corvettes became iconic, their short, stubby hulls ploughing through the Atlantic in all weather, equipped with depth charges and sonar. These vessels, though crude in design, could hunt U-boats with remarkable effectiveness when handled by determined crews. Larger destroyers and frigates added muscle, providing speed and heavier weaponry to strike back at wolf packs. Many escorts were crewed by young men barely trained, yet hardened quickly by the relentless grind of convoy duty. Life aboard these ships was grueling, constant storms, endless watch rotations, and the ever-present fear of a sudden torpedo strike. Still, their very presence forced U-boats to fight, rather than hunt at leisure. The Allies developed escort groups, specialized units of ships trained to work seamlessly together in convoy defense. Each group had a senior officer directing maneuvers, orchestrating attacks with precision and discipline. Their growing skill transformed convoy defense from reactive to proactive, turning escorts into predators rather than prey. This evolution marked a critical shift in the Atlantic War. Technology became the silent ally of the convoy system, steadily tipping the balance against the wolf packs. Sonar, known as ASAC, allowed escorts to detect submerged submarines by bouncing sound waves through the depths. Early models were limited, often losing contact once depth charges exploded, but refinements made detection more reliable over time. Radar soon followed, allowing escorts to spot U-boats surfacing at night to recharge batteries or shadow convoys. Aircraft equipped with radar extended this coverage, flying long patrols and striking with bombs or depth charges when U-boats surfaced. The Americans introduced high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed HFDUF, which pinpointed U-boat radio transmissions and guided escorts to their prey. These advances created a layered defense, where submarines faced detection from sea, sky, and technology itself. The ocean, once a hunting ground for the wolf packs, grew steadily more hostile. U-boat captains found themselves cornered, unable to approach convoys without triggering alarms and counterattacks. Each improvement represented an invisible wall closing around them, shrinking the margins of survival. The convoy system, fortified by science, was becoming a formidable fortress at sea. Tactics also evolved, reshaping how escorts defended their convoys against coordinated wolf-pack assaults. The early response had been simple depth charge attacks, often clumsy and wasteful of ammunition. By 1942, escort commanders had refined patterns of attack, laying barrages of explosives in carefully calculated spreads to box in submarines. Specialized hunter-killer groups emerged, detachments of escorts trained not only to defend, but to chase U-boats aggressively, pursuing them for hours until forced to surface. These groups sometimes operated ahead of the convoy, sweeping the seas clean before the merchantmen arrived. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, further extended the umbrella of protection, launching aircraft directly above convoys. These planes scouted, attacked, and harassed U-boats, depriving them of the cover of night and forcing them into deeper waters. Convoys no longer drifted helplessly across the Atlantic. They moved as armed fortresses, striking back with discipline and fury. The balance of initiative began to shift, and for the first time wolf packs were meeting organized resistance. What had once been one-sided slaughter was becoming a duel of endurance and innovation. Each convoy that reached port intact was a victory not only for the ships, but for the system itself. The convoy system also had profound psychological effects on sailors. Merchant mariners, once terrified of sailing alone, gained confidence knowing escorts circled them like guardians. While the risk of torpedo attack remained high, there was solace in numbers and men felt less isolated on the endless ocean. For escort crews, the responsibility was crushing, but also a source of pride, for they were the thin shield keeping the supply lines alive. The camaraderie between ships grew strong, forged by shared danger and long nights under storm and attack. Each successful defense added to the morale, proving that the U-boats could be beaten. Survivors of sunken ships often rejoined new convoys, carrying stories of horror, but also resilience. Letters home reflected both fear and determination, as sailors described how convoys had become floating communities of war. For the Germans, however, the sight of a convoy bristling with escorts was increasingly demoralizing. What had once been easy hunting turned into grueling contests, where success demanded more risk and brought greater danger. The war at sea was no longer theirs to dictate. The shift in spirit was as critical as the shift in tactics. Behind-the-scenes coordination of convoys demanded immense organizational effort from the Allies. Admiralties in London, Halifax, and Washington created vast networks of intelligence, scheduling, and routing, often working with incomplete information. Ships were grouped based on speed, cargo, and destination, ensuring the convoy moved at the pace of its slowest vessel. Timing was crucial, as convoys had to avoid known U-boat patrol lines or risk ambush. Meteorologists contributed, forecasting storms that could conceal or disrupt wolf-pack attacks. Naval intelligence, aided by code breakers, provided advance warnings of submarine concentrations. Every convoy was a logistical masterpiece, requiring precision and secrecy. Errors could mean disaster, but coordination steadily improved, making convoys more efficient and less vulnerable. To the casual observer, a convoy was simply a group of ships moving in formation. In reality, it was the result of meticulous planning, where every decision could save or doom thousands of lives. The unseen effort ashore made the system possible, ensuring the lifeline to Britain remained unbroken. The Americans, initially reluctant, quickly embraced the convoy concept after their disastrous early encounters with U-boats. By mid-1942, convoys were enforced along the eastern seaboard, stretching from New York to Miami and into the Gulf of Mexico. This change immediately reduced sinkings, as lone merchantmen became rarities. The U-boats, once confident, now faced layered defenses, aircraft patrols, and coordinated escorts. The learning curve had been steep, but the United States had the industrial might to build escorts and Liberty ships in staggering numbers. Combined with British expertise, the transatlantic alliance created a seamless defensive system spanning the entire ocean. No longer could U-boats attack coastlines with impunity. Every approach was met with resistance. By late 1942, convoy losses were declining even as the number of merchant ships at sea increased. The tide had turned slowly, painfully, but decisively. Convoys became the backbone of Allied survival, a shield without which victory would have been impossible. The lesson had been costly, but it was one the Allies never forgot. By 1943, The convoy system had matured into the decisive factor in the Battle of the Atlantic. Wolfpacks still prowled, but their attacks often ended in fierce battles with heavy losses on both sides. Allied escorts, bolstered by technology and numbers, could inflict punishing casualties on submarines, sinking dozens in a single month. Air cover closed the mid-Atlantic Black Gap, denying U-boats their last sanctuary. For the Germans, the campaign became unsustainable, with losses exceeding replacements and morale collapsing among crews. The hunters had become the hunted, and convoys symbolized the shift in naval power. Each convoy that crossed safely represented food, weapons, and reinforcements, sustaining the war effort against the Axis. Without convoys, Britain might have starved. With them, it endured and ultimately triumphed. The convoy system was not merely a tactic, it was the foundation of Allied victory at sea. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, organization and persistence had beaten stealth and surprise. The Wolfpacks had met their match in the disciplined walls of steel and courage. The Battle of the Atlantic was not only a contest of men and steel, but also a relentless duel of invention, where each side sought to outthink and outmaneuver the other with new technology. From the earliest days of convoy defense, the Allies understood that only through innovation could they match the stealth of the U-boat. At the heart of this struggle lay sonar, known then as ADSIC, a device that sent sound waves pulsing into the ocean depths. When those waves bounced back, they revealed the presence of a lurking submarine, though in crude form, and often with frustrating imprecision. At first, sonar gave only range and direction, not depth, forcing escorts to guess how far down their enemy lay. Still, it was a lifeline, transforming blind seas into hunting grounds for alert captains. U-boat commanders soon feared the high-pitched pings echoing through their steel hulls, knowing it meant discovery was close at hand. The struggle between sound and silence defined countless underwater duels, as escorts dropped depth charges in calculated spreads. For the first time, submarines could be tracked rather than merely suspected. Though imperfect, sonar became the first true weapon in the technological war of detection. It marked the beginning of a race that would decide the Atlantic. Radar, meanwhile, opened a new front in the battle for supremacy at sea. While sonar hunted beneath the waves, radar scanned the skies and seas, detecting periscopes, conning towers, and surface submarines even in the blackness of night. Early models were bulky and temperamental, often struggling in stormy weather, but their potential was enormous. By 1941, radar sets mounted on escorts and aircraft began to reveal the Wolfpacks that once stalked with impunity. U-boats that surfaced to recharge batteries or shadow convoys under cover of darkness now found themselves spotted at ranges unthinkable just years before. Pilots of long-range patrol planes, guided by radar screens, could swoop down with bombs and depth charges before a submarine could dive. The once safe haven of night had become a perilous trap, forcing commanders to adapt or die. Radar also provided early warning to convoys, spotting incoming aircraft, and sometimes even the outlines of enemy raiders. Each new refinement tightened the noose, reducing the stealth advantage on which the Wolfpacks relied. What had been a war of ambush was turning into a war of exposure. With radar, the Allies could see where once they had been blind. If sonar and radar gave the Allies eyes and ears, high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed Huff Duff, gave them a voice to follow. U-boat operations depended heavily on radio communication, for Admiral Donitz directed his Wolfpacks with constant signals from headquarters in occupied France. Each order revealed a faint electronic trail, invisible to the naked eye but captured by Allied listening posts. Huff-Duff stations on land triangulated signals, plotting the approximate position of transmitting submarines. Escort ships carried smaller sets, allowing them to react instantly to transmissions during convoy battles. For U-boat captains, the radio became both lifeline and liability, a tool of coordination that simultaneously betrayed their presence. Convoys could be rerouted away from danger, or hunter-killer groups sent directly into patrol lines. The ocean, once infinite, shrank with every intercepted signal. Huff-Duff turned communication into a battlefield, where even a brief message risked disaster. Combined with radar and sonar, it wove an invisible web across the Atlantic. To fight in silence was to isolate the wolf packs. To speak was to risk detection. It was a trap from which there was no escape. Yet the greatest breakthrough of all came not at sea, but in the hidden rooms of intelligence centers, where codebreakers waged their own secret war. The German Navy's Enigma machine, with its shifting ciphers, was believed unbreakable, and for years it kept Allied commanders blind to U-boat intentions. But mathematicians, linguists and cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park in Britain bent their minds to the problem with relentless focus. They built machines, called bombs, designed to unravel the permutations of Enigma with astonishing speed. Success came slowly, but when the first U-boat signals were decrypted, it changed the war overnight. Suddenly convoys could be routed away from danger before wolf packs closed in. Hunter groups could be vectored straight into submarine patrol lines. Each cracked message was a silent victory, unknown to the men at sea, but decisive nonetheless. The project, codenamed U-Ultra, was among the greatest secrets of the war. Its influence extended far beyond the Atlantic, but here it was most critical, saving thousands of lives and millions of tons of shipping. Code breaking was the hidden blade behind the convoy shield. For the Germans, technology became a double-edged sword, promising superiority, but often delivering disappointment against Allied innovation. Dönitz relied on radio coordination, not realizing how fatally vulnerable it made his wolf packs in the age of Huff-Duff. He demanded new devices, such as radar detectors, to warn U-boats of approaching aircraft. Early models, like the Metox receiver, gave temporary relief, but were soon countered by changes in Allied radar frequency. Attempts to silence Allied sonar with noisemakers and decoys proved equally inadequate. The Germans developed the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run engines while submerged, but it came too late, and with flaws that limited its use. Meanwhile, Allied bombers blanketed U-boat pens with explosives, while new technology kept patrol planes over the Atlantic longer than ever before. Each German advance seemed to meet an Allied answer, often before it could shift the balance. The once proud hunters found themselves outmatched, their innovations lagging behind the pace of Allied ingenuity. The dream of technological superiority became a nightmare of obsolescence. For the wolf packs, the tide of invention was no longer in their favor. The integration of these technologies created a synergy that proved unstoppable. Radar spotted U-boats on the surface, Huff-Duff tracked their messages, and sonar chased them below once they dived. Aircraft closed the skies above, patrolling with radar and depth charges that denied submarines even a moment of rest. Escort carriers brought air power into the heart of the convoy, extending the deadly reach of detection. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park directed convoys away from danger, sometimes without the sailors knowing why their course had changed. Every layer of defense overlapped, tightening the grip until U-boat survival became a question of luck rather than skill. By 1943, losses among German submarines reached catastrophic levels, with entire wolf packs annihilated in single battles. Crews entered the sea, knowing their odds of return had collapsed. For the Allies, the transformation was dramatic. What had once been desperate defense became confident control. The ocean lanes were no longer death traps but guarded arteries of war. Technology wielded with discipline had turned the tide. For the men who lived it, the impact of technology was tangible, changing daily life on both sides. U-boat sailors who once surfaced freely now dreaded the sweep of radar, knowing death could arrive in the dark from an unseen aircraft. The pings of sonar haunted their dives, a reminder that the enemy could hear through the ocean itself. Radio operators hesitated, fearing that each signal might lead escorts straight to their position. In contrast, Allied crews felt growing confidence with each new device, learning to trust the hum of radar screens or the sharp returns of sonar echoes. Young men trained in science became warriors, their skill in operating machines as critical as their courage under fire. The war was shifting from brute force to a contest of intellect and innovation. The crew of a corvette or a long-range Liberator bomber felt that they held not just weapons but the future of the Atlantic in their hands. Technology gave them an edge that multiplied their courage. Each successful defense or sinking reinforced their faith in the machines. The battle became as much about trust in circuits and code as in steel and flesh. By the spring of 1943, the technology race had reached its climax, and the wolf packs were losing faster than they could adapt. Convoy battles that once ended in slaughter of merchantmen now concluded with submarines shattered on the seafloor. U-boat losses mounted at unsustainable rates, sometimes 20 or more in a single month. Dönitz, once the architect of victory, admitted that his strategy could not withstand the combined assault of radar, sonar, Huff-Duff, and U-Ultra. The hunter had become the hunted, pursued across an ocean that no longer offered shadows to hide in. For the Allies, this was the moment when desperation turned to dominance, when the sea lanes became safe enough to sustain the full weight of war. Behind every victory stood a network of machines, scientists, and analysts who had made the impossible possible. The Battle of the Atlantic had been a crucible, proving that technology could shape the outcome of history. In the struggle of wolfpack and convoy, invention had outpaced destruction. The tide had turned irreversibly. The war beneath the waves had entered its final phase. By the opening months of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a level of intensity unlike anything seen before. Convoys stretched across the ocean like lifelines, carrying food, oil, ammunition, and troops that kept Britain alive and prepared America's strength for the liberation of Europe. Opposing them were hundreds of German U-boats, operating in wolf packs that prowled the sea lanes from Iceland to West Africa. For Adolf Hitler and Admiral Karl Dönitz, these submarines represented the one weapon capable of forcing Britain into submission. In January and February, sinkings remained high, with dozens of merchant ships sent to the bottom in single convoy battles. But beneath the surface of these statistics, the balance was beginning to shift. Allied escorts grew in number, their tactics sharper, their radar and sonar more refined. Escort carriers, bringing aircraft into the heart of convoys, extended the deadly reach of protection across previously unguarded waters. The U-boats, once the hunters, began to find themselves increasingly the prey, and 1943, which Dönitz had believed would be his year of decision, instead became the year of reckoning. The heart of this reversal came in the form of intelligence and coordination. Ultra-decrypts of Enigma messages provided Allied commanders with extraordinary foresight, allowing them to reroute convoys away from massed wolf packs. On land, the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, became the nerve center of the Atlantic War, coordinating convoys with the precision of a vast chessboard. Air patrols filled more and more of the mid-ocean gap, the so-called airless black hole that had once offered U-boats sanctuary. Liberator bombers, fitted with radar and long-range fuel tanks, began to scour the seas from Newfoundland to Ireland. At sea, hunter-killer groups formed around escort carriers, seeking out submarines rather than waiting for them to strike. In battle after battle, the Allies combined sonar, radar, and huff-duff into a seamless web of detection. For the U-boats, there were fewer shadows left in which to hide. Their commanders complained that every maneuver seemed anticipated, every refuge compromised. What had been a silent war now rang with constant pursuit. The tables were turning rapidly. The decisive moment arrived in the spring of 1943, when a series of convoy battles demonstrated the new reality of the Atlantic. Convoys SC-118, HX-229, and SC-122 were attacked by massive wolf packs, involving over 40 U-boats at a time. For a brief moment, the ferocity of these battles suggested that the German strategy still held promise. Dozens of merchantmen were sunk, and panic rippled through shipping lines. But the cost to the U-boats was staggering, with many failing to return to their bases on the French coast. Escort vessels, using sonar and radar in coordination, hunted submarines with ruthless efficiency. Aircraft swooped down at night, guided by radar beams that pierced the darkness. Each German success was matched by greater losses, eroding the striking power of the fleet. By April, Dönitz recognized the scale of the disaster. His proud armadas were being torn apart faster than they could be replaced. It was no longer a contest of endurance, but a battle of annihilation, and the U-boats were losing. May 1943 became known as the Black May of the German U-boat arm, the month when the tide finally and irrevocably turned. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed, their wrecks littering the seabed of the North Atlantic. The losses represented nearly a quarter of the operational fleet, a blow from which recovery was nearly impossible. Convoys like ONS-5 demonstrated the full effect of Allied superiority. In that battle, 43 U-boats attacked relentlessly, but only 12 merchantmen were lost, while 6 submarines were sunk and many more damaged. The lesson was unmistakable. The wolf pack, once feared as an unstoppable predator, had been broken by the combined strength of technology, intelligence, and coordination. Survivors of the battles returned to their bases at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, with crews shaken and morale shattered. Dönitz faced a grim reality, forced to withdraw his boats temporarily from the North Atlantic. The dream of starving Britain into submission had collapsed in the roar of depth charges. The hunters had become the hunted. The consequences of Black May extended beyond the battlefield into the very heart of German strategy. Dönitz had staked his career and reputation on the Wolfpack doctrine, believing massed submarines could overwhelm even the best protected convoys. But the mathematics of loss now outweighed the promise of victory. Each U-boat sunk meant dozens of trained men gone, their expertise irreplaceable. The training pipelines could not keep pace, and new crews arrived inexperienced, vulnerable, and ill-prepared for the deadly gauntlet awaiting them. Hitler, frustrated by the failures, pressed for new technological solutions like the Type XXLO U-boat, a revolutionary design that promised restored superiority. Yet these innovations were years away, and the immediate crisis demanded answers that Dönitz could not provide. The prestige of the U-boat arm, once the pride of the Reich, was now in question. For the Allies, The shift in momentum was undeniable. The lifeline across the Atlantic was secure, ensuring that men, weapons, and supplies would flow without interruption. The strategic balance of the entire war was shifting. For the sailors who fought these battles, the turning point of 1943 was lived in moments of terror and relief. Allied merchant seamen, once resigned to high losses, began to sense that survival was finally on their side. The sight of escort carriers overhead and the sound of radar operators calling out contacts gave them confidence in voyages once considered doomed. Escort crews grew more aggressive, chasing sonar echoes with relentless determination. In contrast, U-boat sailors faced nights filled with fear, hunted by machines that seemed to know their every move. Survivors' testimonies spoke of claustrophobic dives, hulls creaking under pressure, and the dread of depth charges rolling into the sea above. For many, the knowledge that the odds of returning home were diminishing each month drained morale. Even Dönitz admitted privately that his men were being slaughtered in a battle they could no longer win. The human toll was immense, felt in every sinking and every silent patrol that never returned. The war beneath the waves had entered its darkest hour. The Allies capitalized on their triumph with renewed vigor, pressing the advantage that technology and coordination had delivered. Shipyards in America launched Liberty ships faster than they could be sunk, swelling the convoys with supplies that fueled the Allied war machine. Naval escorts multiplied, their crews seasoned by years of experience and hardened by success. Aircraft carriers prowled the Atlantic with growing confidence, their squadrons sweeping away any submarine bold enough to surface. Intelligence centers hummed with intercepted signals, decrypting messages that gave convoys a near-clairvoyant awareness of danger. Each successful voyage across the Atlantic strengthened the Allied armies preparing for the invasion of Europe. By contrast, German shipyards struggled under constant bombing, their ability to replace lost submarines crippled. The strategic initiative had slipped beyond Dönitz's grasp. His wolf packs, once the terror of the seas, now limped back to base under constant attack. The Atlantic, once contested, was becoming an Allied stronghold, and the outcome of the wider war was now inevitable. The turning point of 1943 in the Atlantic was more than a naval victory. It was the hinge of global strategy. With secure sea lanes, the Allies could amass overwhelming force for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Tanks, planes, men, and fuel crossed the ocean in safety, transforming Britain into a springboard for liberation. In the Mediterranean, supplies flowed unimpeded to support campaigns in Italy. For the Soviets, the relief was immense, as Lend-Lease convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk delivered desperately needed equipment. The U-boat menace, once feared as capable of altering the war's outcome, had been contained. For Germany, the dream of strangling Britain had died beneath the waves of the Atlantic. For the Allies, the victory was proof that persistence, science, and coordination could triumph even in the face of mortal peril. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but its outcome was decided. The wolf packs had been broken, and the tide of war had turned. May 1943 entered history as the month when the U-boat arm met its reckoning on the cold, unforgiving waters of the Atlantic. For nearly 4 years, German submarines had stalked Allied shipping with ruthless precision, carving out what Dönitz believed would be the decisive campaign of the war. But in May, the hunters found themselves relentlessly pursued, cornered and destroyed at a rate that shocked even their most seasoned commanders. In that single month, 41 U-boats were lost, each with crews of 50 or more men, swallowed by the ocean's depths. These losses represented nearly 1/4 of the operational fleet, an unsustainable hemorrhage that could no longer be hidden from Hitler or the German public. Convoy ONS-5 stood at the center of this catastrophe, a running battle in which more than 40 U-boats descended on a slow-moving Allied column. At first, sinking seemed to vindicate the Wolfpack tactic, but the escorts, armed with radar, sonar, and aircraft, struck back with a fury. 6 submarines were sunk in one convoy battle alone, and many others limped home battered, leaking, and defeated. In Liverpool, Western Approach's command marked the turning tide with grim satisfaction, knowing the balance had permanently shifted. For the first time, the Allies had the confidence that the U-boats could be not merely resisted, but destroyed outright. Black May marked the breaking of the Wolfpacks. The intensity of convoy battles during Black May revealed just how far Allied technology and coordination had come. Long-range aircraft, once absent from the vast central Atlantic, now closed the air gap with squadrons of Liberators and Sunderlands sweeping the seas. Radar operators tracked periscopes at night, their screens glowing as signals revealed the positions of predators who once thought themselves invisible. Escort carriers brought the power of airstrikes directly into convoy formations, circling above to deter or annihilate submarines attempting to surface. Destroyers and corvettes, once tentative in their hunts, now attacked aggressively, dropping depth charges with precision guided by sonar and Huff-Duff direction finding. The German advantage of surprise had evaporated, replaced by constant exposure. U-boat commanders complained that Allied escorts seemed to know their every move, appearing at the exact moment they thought themselves safe. Communications security, once believed impenetrable, had been compromised by U-ultra decrypts, giving the Allies uncanny foresight. Each failed attack drained morale further, with survivors realizing they were no longer predators but prey. The Wolfpack doctrine that had defined Donitz's strategy was now unraveling in the relentless storm of Allied countermeasures. Black May was the proof that the tide of the Atlantic War had irreversibly turned. The human cost of Black May was staggering, with thousands of German sailors vanishing into the deep. Each U-boat carried around 50 men, meaning the loss of 41 submarines equated to nearly 2,000 lives extinguished in just 31 days. Survivors were rare, often pulled from freezing waters by Allied escorts, only to become prisoners of war. Their testimonies revealed the sheer terror of the hunts, hulls buckling under depth-charged shockwaves, batteries failing as toxic fumes filled compartments, and morale crumbling under constant attack. Men lived in darkness, sweat dripping as the boat groaned and shuddered, waiting for the explosion that might tear it apart. Even when they surfaced, the ocean sky was no longer safe, as Allied aircraft swooped with merciless efficiency. The once legendary esprit de corps of U-boat crews faltered, their songs and traditions drowned by despair. In Germany, families waited in vain for letters from loved ones who would never return. Dönitz, who had built his reputation on loyalty to his men, faced the unbearable burden of watching them die in droves. Black May was not just a tactical defeat, it was a human tragedy of epic proportions. The myth of the invincible U-boat arm had been shattered by sacrifice and loss. Convoy ONS-5 epitomized the new reality. A clash that spanned a week in late April and early May. 43 U-boats assembled to annihilate the slow convoy, believing their numerical strength would overwhelm the escorts. At first their success seemed certain as merchantmen burned in the night, their crews scrambling into lifeboats amid chaos. Yet the escorts fought with grim determination, their radar and sonar guiding them unerringly to their attackers. Destroyers, like HMS Duncan and corvettes like HMS Pink unleashed relentless depth charge barrages that tore apart U-boats one after another. Aircraft joined the battle, dropping bombs and strafing the waves as the Germans attempted to regroup. By the battle's end, 12 merchant ships had been sunk, but the price for the U-boats was catastrophic: 6 destroyed, several others crippled, and morale gutted. For the Allies, the outcome was a revelation, showing that even against massive wolf pack concentrations, convoys could prevail. For the Germans, it was the writing on the wall, proof that no number of submarines could overcome Allied coordination. The legend of U-boat dominance ended amid the wreckage of ONS-5. Black May was the breaking point. Dönitz, watching the slaughter unfold, faced his most difficult decision of the war. His strategy of massed wolf packs, which had carried such promise, was now revealed as fatally flawed in the face of Allied supremacy. Reports poured in from the Atlantic, submarines sunk before they reached their hunting grounds, convoys slipping through untouched, and commanders refusing to take reckless risks with untrained crews. In desperation, he ordered a temporary withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that continued operations meant only massacre. The retreat was both a strategic necessity and a devastating admission of failure. For the Allies, it was the ultimate validation of their efforts, proof that years of technological innovation and sacrifice had borne fruit. For the German High Command, it was a humiliation, stripping away the one weapon that had once offered hope of starving Britain into submission. Hitler, ever impatient, demanded new solutions, but the promised Type XX-1 Wonder U-boat remained years from deployment. Dönitz had lost the initiative, and with it the chance to alter the war's course. Black May forced Germany's naval command to confront the reality they had long denied. The U-boat arm was broken. The ripple effects of Black May extended far beyond the Atlantic itself. With secure sea lanes, Allied planners could commit to operations on a scale previously unimaginable. The build-up for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, depended on an uninterrupted flow of supplies across the ocean. American factories churned out tanks, trucks, and aircraft, knowing they would reach Britain safely. Convoys carried not only weapons, but also the soldiers who would storm the beaches of Normandy. Simultaneously, the Mediterranean campaign gained momentum, supplied by shipping no longer threatened on a massive scale. The Soviet Union, too, benefited as Arctic convoys delivered tanks and food to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The survival of these convoys, once considered doubtful, became routine by late 1943. The Allies no longer fought merely to survive, they fought to prepare for victory, and Black May had made that possible, turning the tide of the entire global war. For German sailors, the psychological blow of Black May was lasting and devastating. Veterans who had once set out with confidence now returned haunted, warning recruits of the near certainty of death. Training schools attempted to instill discipline, but the truth spread quickly. The Atlantic was a graveyard, and U-boat crews were walking into a slaughter. Letters from home spoke of grief and fear, as entire towns lost sons to the unforgiving sea. Even propaganda films, once filled with triumphant imagery of U-boat hunters, fell silent in the face of undeniable disaster. Dönitz appealed for loyalty, declaring his men martyrs for Germany's survival, but the mystique had vanished. The myth of invincibility was replaced by the grim arithmetic of annihilation. For the Allies, the sight of surrendering U-boat crews underscored the turning tide, proof that the once feared predators were broken men. The sea itself seemed to belong to the Allies now, their convoys marching west to east in an endless parade. Black May had turned courage into futility for Germany's submariners, and the war beneath the waves would never be the same again. In the final reckoning, Black May was not just a month of battles, but a decisive pivot in the history of the Second World War. Never again would the U-boats hold the upper hand in the Atlantic. Though they continued to fight, and though new technologies promised miracles, the momentum had shifted permanently. The Allies controlled the seas, ensuring the flow of men and material that would crush Hitler's empire. For Germany, the loss of the U-boat arms dominance marked the failure of a grand strategy that had once promised victory. For the world, it proved that persistence, innovation, and sacrifice could overcome even the deadliest of threats. 41 wrecks at the bottom of the Atlantic told the story of ambition destroyed by reality. Thousands of men perished, their boats entombed beneath the waves, victims of a strategy that had run its course. Black May was the death knell of the wolf packs, the moment the tide turned for good, and it stands as one of the most decisive months in the entire war, when history itself changed course beneath the grey Atlantic sky. While the Battle of the Atlantic raged at its fiercest, the U-boats were never confined to a single theatre of war. From the earliest days of the conflict, Karl Donitz recognized the need to extend operations into other seas, spreading Allied defenses thin and striking vulnerable shipping routes. The Arctic convoys, bound for Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, became lifelines for the Soviet Union, and thus prime targets for German submarines. In the Mediterranean, Axis ambitions depended on maintaining supply lines to North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps fought desperately against the British Eighth Army. Meanwhile, as the war widened into a global conflict, German submarines sailed as far as the Indian Ocean, seeking Allied shipping lanes stretching from South Africa to India. This diversification of operations demonstrated both the ambition and the desperation of the Kriegsmarine, which sought every opportunity to pressure the Allies. Each theatre carried unique challenges, from the icy waters of the Arctic to the sunlit but heavily patrolled Mediterranean. The U-boats that ventured into these seas carried with them the same doctrine of stealth and sudden destruction, but often found themselves up against new enemies and unexpected conditions. What unfolded was a story of innovation, courage, and gradual decline, as Germany's submariners discovered the limits of their reach. Beyond the Atlantic, the war beneath the waves entered strange and unforgiving arenas. The Arctic convoys were among the most dangerous routes of the entire war, and U-boats played a central role in their bloody saga. Beginning in 1941, convoys laden with tanks, trucks, food, and aircraft set sail from Britain and Iceland, braving storms and ice to reach the Soviet north. U-boats patrolled these frigid waters alongside surface raiders like the battleship Tirpitz, seeking to sever the flow of supplies that Stalin demanded. The submariners faced not only Allied escorts, but also nature itself, with sub-zero temperatures freezing periscopes and ice choking the decks. Convoy PQ-17 in 1942 became infamous, when fear of a German surface attack led to dispersal, and U-boats picked off merchantmen in a feeding frenzy. German submarines believed these Arctic routes could cripple the Soviet war effort if attacked relentlessly. Yet Allied persistence, reinforced by escorts and air cover from Russia's northern bases, gradually reduced the U-boats' impact. Losses among submarines increased as convoys grew stronger and more coordinated. Survivors spoke of icy waters killing men within minutes, if forced to abandon ship, making rescues rare and terrifying. The Arctic campaigns revealed the brutal extremes of submarine warfare. For Germany, it was a theatre of opportunity, but also one of attrition and bitter cold. The Mediterranean presented a very different set of challenges for U-boat crews. The narrow sea lanes between Italy and North Africa were critical for supplying Rommel's forces, and Dönitz dispatched submarines to intercept Allied convoys moving through Gibraltar and toward Malta. Here, submariners confronted clear, shallow waters that made concealment difficult, as the Mediterranean was far less forgiving than the vast Atlantic. Allied air power blanketed the region, with patrols flying from Malta, Egypt, and Gibraltar, leaving U-boats vulnerable each time they surfaced. Despite these dangers, German submarines achieved notable successes, sinking merchantmen and warships alike, disrupting vital supply lines. Yet the Mediterranean was also where U-boat losses mounted heavily, with many crews destroyed by depth charges dropped from corvettes and aircraft in waters too shallow to allow escape. The experience of these crews was one of constant pressure, hunted day and night by vigilant enemies. Survivors recalled the sense of fighting in a glass aquarium, where every movement seemed exposed. The Mediterranean theater became a graveyard for many U-boats, even as they fought with determination. For the Kriegsmarine, it was a costly but necessary extension of their campaign. The submarine war in the Mediterranean symbolized both daring and futility. Farther afield, the Indian Ocean became a surprising theater for U-boat operations. From 1942, flotillas of submarines sailed thousands of miles from European bases to strike Allied shipping routes linking the Middle East, India, and Australia. These voyages were long and perilous, demanding endurance and careful navigation through waters patrolled by British and Commonwealth forces. The submariners who reached the Indian Ocean found rich hunting grounds, with convoys often lightly defended and merchant ships sailing independently. U-boats prowled near the Cape of Good Hope off Madagascar and along the Indian coast, sinking freighters that carried vital resources for the Allied war effort. Cooperation with the Japanese added a strange dimension to these campaigns, as German submarines occasionally coordinated with their Axis partners in Asia. The Indian Ocean offered temporary respite from the heavy losses of the Atlantic, but Allied defenses quickly adapted, dispatching escort carriers and patrol aircraft to close the gap. By 1944, the tide had turned even here, as submarines faced the same deadly mix of radar, air patrols, and hunter-killer groups. The dream of a second Atlantic in the Indian Ocean faded, replaced by more wrecks scattered across warm seas. Beyond Europe, the war was no kinder to Germany's submariners. Distance only delayed defeat. The extension of U-boat warfare beyond the Atlantic was as much psychological as it was strategic. Hitler demanded that no corner of the globe be free from German reach, a vision that forced submariners into campaigns that often stretched their endurance to the breaking point. In the Arctic, the cold tested their equipment and humanity. In the Mediterranean, the constant visibility stripped away stealth, and in the Indian Ocean, the distances strained logistics and morale. Yet for all these hardships, the submariners pressed on, believing their actions could alter the course of the war. Every convoy they disrupted meant delayed tanks, aircraft, or food, a hope that gave purpose to their suffering. But the larger strategic picture showed diminishing returns. The Allies, with vast industrial power and a global navy, could absorb losses that once would have crippled them. For every ship sunk in distant seas, 2 more were launched from American yards. Submarine warfare had become an equation of diminishing effectiveness. The expansion of the battle spread thin the Kriegsmarine's most valuable weapon. Beyond the Atlantic, the limits of Germany's naval reach became starkly clear. The experiences of U-boat crews in these far-flung theaters also reflected the diversity of the war itself. In the Arctic, they fought against nature's wrath as fiercely as against the Allies. In the Mediterranean, they lived under skies constantly buzzing with enemy aircraft, a reminder of Allied air superiority. In the Indian Ocean, they encountered new cultures and unfamiliar seas, far removed from the European struggle. Each mission carried with it stories of bravery, despair, and endurance. Tales that echoed the larger saga of the U-boat war. Men froze at their stations in Arctic waters, sweated under tropical suns, and bled beneath depth-charge attacks in every corner of the globe. They sailed for months without seeing land, surviving on dwindling rations and stale air recycled through their submarines. Their sacrifices highlighted the universality of war, fought across every climate and geography. For the Allies, the global reach of the U-boats was a constant reminder of the danger lurking beneath the seas. Yet the very breadth of these campaigns stretched German resources beyond sustainability. In extending their war everywhere, the U-boats had overreached themselves. Strategically, the expansion of U-boat operations beyond the Atlantic failed to produce the decisive results Dönitz had envisioned. The Arctic convoys continued, delivering tanks and food to the Soviet Union despite heavy losses. In the Mediterranean, the Axis eventually lost North Africa, proving that U-boat interference could not compensate for Allied superiority. In the Indian Ocean, disruptions were temporary, and by 1944, the Allies sailed with impunity once more. Each theatre consumed precious boats and crews that might have been concentrated in the Atlantic, the only battlefield where Germany had once held an edge. Historians later argued whether Dönitz's decision to spread his fleet thin accelerated the collapse of the U-boat campaign. For the men who fought and died in distant seas, the question was irrelevant. They did their duty where ordered, often without seeing the larger picture. Yet the results were clear. The wolf packs that once terrorized the Atlantic could not replicate their success elsewhere. The extension of submarine warfare revealed not strength, but weakness. It showed the slow, inevitable decline of Germany's undersea war. In the final analysis, the story of U-boat operations beyond the Atlantic reflects the rise and fall of Germany's naval ambition. It began with daring, as submarines surged into new waters to strike at vulnerable convoys. It continued with sacrifice, as men fought and died in hostile seas far from home. And it ended with futility, as the Allies adapted, overcame and secured their global supply lines. The Arctic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean campaigns remain testaments to the courage of the crews and the desperation of the strategy. Each wreck scattered across icy, shallow, or tropical waters stands as a silent monument to lives lost in a doomed cause. Beyond the Atlantic, the wolf packs found not triumph, but the limits of their reach. The dream of global dominance by submarine dissolved into defeat. The Allies held the oceans, and the war turned inexorably against Germany. What remained was the memory of extraordinary endurance, set against the futility of a strategy that could no longer deliver victory. The wolf packs once feared everywhere were now hunted everywhere. By 1942, the Allies realized that victory at sea would not come solely from clever tactics or advanced technologies. Instead, it would come from the raw power of industrial might, churning out ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. Central to this strategy was the American shipbuilding program, most famously embodied in the Liberty ships. These standardized cargo vessels, designed for rapid construction and mass production, became the backbone of Allied logistics. Built in civilian shipyards using assembly line methods, they transformed maritime supply into an unstoppable flood. Where Germany could sink 10 ships, America could build 20 replacements. This imbalance shifted the arithmetic of the Atlantic, tilting it decisively against the wolf packs. The Liberty ships were not glamorous. They were boxy, slow, and utilitarian, yet each one carried tanks, aircraft, food, and ammunition vital to sustaining the war effort. They symbolized how industry became as important as battlefield victories. and they proved that Germany's undersea campaign could not overcome sheer numerical superiority. The Liberty ship program began with skepticism, but soon it astonished the world with its scale and speed. Using prefabricated sections, workers could assemble ships in record time, some in less than 2 weeks from keel laying to launch. Entire shipyards were devoted to this task, employing tens of thousands of men and women, including many who had never worked in heavy industry before the war. Training was rapid, the processes simplified, and the production lines relentless. By the end of the war, over 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, a staggering number that dwarfed U-boat successes. Even when submarines claimed victories against convoys, the losses were quickly absorbed, with replacement ships already sailing from American yards. Germany's hope of starving Britain into submission collapsed under this flood of steel and manpower. Shipbuilding became a theatre of war in itself, where riveters, welders, and engineers were as essential as soldiers and sailors. The Allies turned industry into a weapon, one that could not be hunted down by torpedoes. Every new Liberty ship was a victory against the wolf packs. It was an industrial miracle, and it saved the Atlantic lifeline. The impact of the Liberty ships was not only in numbers but also in what they carried. Each vessel could haul thousands of tons of cargo, including vital food shipments to Britain, fuel for Allied fleets, and military equipment destined for multiple fronts. Without them, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, the North African campaign, and the rearming of the Soviet Union would have been impossible. The ships transported jeeps, Sherman tanks, locomotives, and aircraft parts across oceans infested with U-boats. They also carried soldiers, millions of them, who would fight in Europe, Africa, and Asia. In this way, the Liberty ships became arteries of war, pumping life into the Allied military machine. Every safe crossing reinforced the Allied advance, while every sinking became a temporary setback quickly corrected. The Germans recognized this, targeting convoys with relentless determination. Yet the balance of supply always tipped in favor of the Allies, who had embraced mass production with unmatched energy. Liberty ships became the logistical lifeline of global war. They carried not only material, but also hope, and their presence ensured that Allied strategy remained viable. The Allied war machine was more than just Liberty ships. It was a system of production that spanned continents. American shipyards launched not only cargo ships, but also escort destroyers, aircraft carriers, and tankers. British yards continued to build merchantmen and naval escorts, while Canadian shipbuilders added corvettes and freighters to the fleet. This combined output created redundancy and resilience, making it impossible for U-boats to impose the decisive blockade Dönitz envisioned. Factories produced radar units, sonar sets, and depth charges at a pace that ensured every new convoy had stronger defences. Airfields across Britain and Iceland filled with long-range patrol aircraft, supported by industrial output of bombers like the B-24 Liberator. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Submarines faced not only more targets but also better protected ones, escorted by warships bristling with sensors and weapons. The Allied war machine was a web of factories, shipyards, and logistical planning, coordinated with precision. It was war fought by engineers, planners, and labourers, as much as by admirals and generals, and it was this industrial onslaught that crushed the wolf packs. The scale of the Allied shipbuilding program highlighted a stark contrast between Germany and its enemies. The United States could mobilize resources across an entire continent, drawing on iron from Minnesota, oil from Texas, and labor from every state, Britain. despite suffering bombings and shortages, maintained steady production, reinforced by supplies from the Commonwealth. Canada, though smaller, punched far above its weight, launching thousands of ships from Halifax, Vancouver, and other ports. Germany, in contrast, lacked both the industrial depth and the raw materials to compete. U-boat construction never matched the pace of Allied replacements, and the introduction of advanced types like the Type 61 came far too late. Hitler's economy was geared toward land war, leaving the Kriegsmarine underfunded and under-resourced. The Liberty ship program exposed this imbalance brutally. Where Germany built a handful of boats, America built a fleet. Where Germany lost trained sailors, America trained thousands more shipbuilders and seamen. The equation was decisive. The Allies were fighting a war of attrition, and they had the numbers to win it. Behind every Liberty ship was a story of labor and determination. In shipyards across America, men and women worked around the clock, welding steel plates, riveting sections, and painting hulls. The workforce was diverse, including African Americans, women in roles traditionally denied them, and immigrants eager to support the war effort. Their labor blurred the line between civilian and soldier, as they knew each vessel built was another step toward victory. Propaganda posters and newsreels celebrated their work, portraying shipbuilders as vital warriors on the home front. The pride they took in their accomplishments fueled morale, reminding the public that their hands were part of the fight. Launch ceremonies, where Liberty ships slid into the water draped in flags, became symbols of hope and perseverance. For many workers, it was their first taste of industrial labor, yet they adapted quickly under the pressure of wartime necessity. Shipyards became cities unto themselves, humming with activity day and night. The Liberty ships were steel embodiments of this collective effort, and they proved that modern war was won as much by factories as by fleets. The success of the Allied war machine created a profound strategic shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. Donitz's vision of starving Britain into submission by severing its lifelines was shattered. No matter how many ships the U-boats sank, more replacements emerged, often before the loss was even fully accounted for. Convoys grew stronger, more numerous, and increasingly difficult to penetrate. By 1943, the wolf packs faced not just escorts, but also overwhelming industrial momentum. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly, with the Allies flooding the seas with steel and supplies. The Liberty ships embodied this momentum, a tide that no submarine force could stem. Even when Allied losses spiked during wolfpack attacks, the supply system remained resilient. Factories never stopped, yards never closed, and the flow of ships never slowed. For Germany, this meant the strategic initiative was permanently lost. The war at sea had become a war of production, and in production the Allies were unassailable. In retrospect, the Allied war machine demonstrated the decisive role of industry in modern warfare. Victory at sea did not come from a single battle, but from the relentless replacement of losses and the continuous strengthening of defenses. Liberty ships, mass-produced and unassuming, symbolized the triumph of quantity over the terror of U-boats. They sailed in convoys that stretched beyond the horizon, carrying the material that made D-Day, the Eastern Front offensives, and the final push into Germany possible. Without them, the Allies could not have sustained their armies or supplied their allies. The wolf packs, once feared predators, were slowly starved of opportunity, outmatched not by daring but by steel. The Allied war machine turned the tide, proving that factories could be as powerful as fleets. It was not only men with rifles and sailors at sea who won the war, but also riveters, welders, and machinists who never left their home ports. This industrial miracle ensured that supply lines endured and victory remained within reach. In the end, the Liberty ships and their kin sank the wolf packs more surely than depth charges ever did. The war machine had spoken, and it spoke in overwhelming numbers. The story of the U-boat war is not only one of strategy, technology, and industrial might, it is also a story written in human suffering and sacrifice. Beneath the statistics and tonnage charts lay the lives of young sailors, most of them barely out of adolescence, who were cast into the most dangerous branch of the German armed forces. U-boat service carried a mystique in Nazi propaganda, portraying its sailors as the knights of the deep, daring hunters striking at the heart of the British Empire. But the grim reality was far removed from these illusions. By the end of the war, nearly 40,000 men had served aboard U-boats, and of those more than 30,000 would never return. This staggering casualty rate of over 70% made U-boat service the most lethal assignment of the Second World War. Every patrol became a roll of the dice, with long odds against survival as the Allies' grip on the Atlantic tightened. Submariners knew that their steel coffin might become their grave at any moment. Yet they sailed, driven by duty, fear, indoctrination, or simple resignation. Their fate became one of the greatest human tragedies of the war at sea. Life aboard a U-boat was grueling even before enemy action. Crews lived in impossibly cramped quarters, with no privacy, little fresh air, and a constant atmosphere of dampness and diesel fumes. Fresh food ran out within days, leaving sailors to subsist on canned rations, often spoiled by the heat of the engine room. Sanitation was primitive, with one small toilet shared by dozens of men, often out of order after the first days at sea. Sleep came in shifts, with men sharing bunks in a system called hot bunking, where one man slid into a still warm bed vacated by another. The psychological toll was immense, compounded by weeks of silence, boredom, and the ever-present knowledge that death might arrive in an instant. When the depth charges fell, the crew could do little but wait as the submarine groaned and rivets popped under pressure. Each blast could mean the end, and yet, paradoxically, long stretches of calm bred their own kind of torment. The human cost was not measured only in death, but in the slow erosion of sanity. Service in the U-boats was a relentless assault on body and mind, and still, thousands of men volunteered, many believing they were serving a higher cause. For families back in Germany, the cost was measured in long silences, and telegrams bearing the black seal of loss. Mothers, wives, and children lived with the gnawing uncertainty of whether their loved one would return from the sea. Unlike soldiers on land, whose fate might at least be known through captured letters or battlefield reports, U-boat crews often disappeared without trace. A submarine lost in the Atlantic left no survivors, no graves, and no closure. Families were left in a limbo of grief, clinging to hope that sometimes stretched into years. The Nazi regime sought to cloak these losses in glory, holding ceremonies that emphasized heroism rather than despair. Yet behind closed doors, the grief was raw, unadorned, and unending. The sheer number of families affected, tens of thousands across Germany, created a silent sea of mourning. In port cities like Kiel and Hamburg, whole neighborhoods felt the sting of loss. The war beneath the waves left scars not only on sailors, but on an entire nation's households. The human cost rippled far beyond the cramped hulls of the U-boats themselves. Even among survivors, the toll of U-boat service remained etched for life. Men who endured multiple patrols carried deep psychological wounds, sometimes unseen but always present. Many suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the memory of depth charge attacks, or the cries of dying shipmates. The smell of diesel, the sound of rushing water, or even a simple storm at sea could trigger panic decades after the war. Survivors recalled nights when silence was broken only by the creaks of their hull and the distant pings of sonar searching for them. Every ping meant discovery. Every pause in the barrage meant the hunters were still nearby. Even when they returned to port, the knowledge that dozens of comrades would never see land again cast a shadow over each homecoming. For many, the guilt of survival was heavier than the medals pinned to their chests. They asked why fate had spared them when so many others were lost. This survivor's burden became another dimension of the human cost. It ensured that victory for them always felt incomplete. There were moments of fleeting humanity, even in the merciless struggle. Some U-boat crews, upon sinking merchant ships, tried to aid survivors, tossing rafts or supplies before slipping away. Yet, as the war intensified and Hitler demanded ruthless efficiency, such gestures became increasingly rare. Allied survivors often remembered the haunting sight of U-boats surfacing in the moonlight, their crews watching silently before vanishing into the night. For the submariners themselves, these encounters carried their own kind of torment. They were men, not machines, and they knew they were condemning others to death by cold or starvation. The line between predator and victim blurred as both sides suffered from the sea's indifference. Many U-boat sailors confessed after the war that the cries of drowning men echoed in their dreams for the rest of their lives. This invisible wound was as devastating as any physical injury. For some, it eroded their faith in the war entirely, and for others it hardened them, numbing them against compassion. In either case, the cost was borne not just in bodies, but in souls. The magnitude of U-boat losses stunned even their commanders. Karl Donitz, architect of the Wolfpack strategy, referred to his crews as the Grey Wolves and believed in their sacrifice with almost religious fervor. Yet as the casualty lists mounted, even he struggled with the weight of command. By 1943, he knew that sending men into the Atlantic was increasingly a sentence of death. Still, he pressed on, convinced that Germany's survival depended on it. The sailors followed, not always out of loyalty to Hitler, but from discipline, comradeship, or lack of choice. In his post-war writings, Donitz tried to cloak the losses in terms of honor and duty, but the raw numbers betrayed the truth. The U-boat arm had become a slaughterhouse, consuming the lives of its finest young men at a rate no military branch could sustain. For the men who fought, the price of obedience was almost always paid in full. They were trapped in a machine larger than themselves, and it chewed them to pieces. Leadership's faith in strategy demanded a human payment few could comprehend, and that payment was delivered in tens of thousands of lives. Stories of individual survival brought the human cost into sharp focus. Sailors who escaped sinking submarines often endured unimaginable ordeals. Some floated for days in the Atlantic, clinging to wreckage, watching comrades slip beneath the waves one by one. Others were captured and spent years in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, haunted by the fate of their lost boats. A few rare survivors were picked up by rescue ships, their tales revealing the terror of steel breaking under depth-charge attack. One recalled the submarine shaking like a tin can as the explosions thundered around them, the air filled with the stench of oil and fear. Another described the moment of surfacing after hours of pursuit, the crew staggering on deck into the light, grateful simply to breathe again. These testimonies give voice to the thousands who perished silently beneath the sea. They remind us that behind every statistic was a beating heart, a life, a story cut short. The human cost was not abstract, it was personal, intimate, and endless, and its echoes still reverberate through history. In the end, the legacy of the U-boat war is inseparable from the sacrifice of its crews. They were young men caught between loyalty, indoctrination, and sheer circumstance, sent into a battle they could not win. Their death rate was unparalleled in modern warfare, a grim testament to the futility of Germany's strategy. For every Liberty ship launched, a U-boat crew faced the abyss. For every convoy that slipped safely across the Atlantic, another submarine was consigned to silence. The human cost was not measured only in lost lives, but in broken families, haunted survivors, and the wasted potential of a generation. It stands as a reminder that war is not only fought with steel and strategy, but with flesh and blood. The wolf packs may have been remembered for their menace, but their sailors paid the ultimate price for a campaign doomed from the start. History judges the strategy as flawed, but it remembers the sailors as men trapped in it. Their suffering adds a human face to the cold statistics of tonnage and sinkings, and it ensures that the story of the U-boats is, above all, a story of sacrifice. By 1943, as the U-boat fleet bled out in the Atlantic, Germany's naval engineers and command staff recognized that only a technological miracle could reverse the tide. The traditional designs of the Type 7 and Type 9 boats, once deadly predators, had become obsolete against Allied radar, sonar, and relentless escort carriers. The answer emerged from the drawing boards in the form of the Type Dex XS, a submarine so advanced it was often described as decades ahead of its time. Nicknamed the Electroboot, it was designed not as a surface vessel that could submerge, but as a true underwater warship. Unlike earlier U-boats that relied heavily on surfacing to recharge batteries and maneuver, the Type Dex's all could remain submerged for prolonged periods, making it nearly invisible to Allied patrols. Its streamlined hull, free of traditional deck guns and clutter, was optimized for speed and stealth beneath the waves. Engineers envisioned a vessel capable of cruising underwater faster than most destroyers could hunt it. The new design represented the culmination of lessons learned in blood across years of undersea combat. To German admirals, it promised a chance to restore the shattered myth of U-boat supremacy. To its sailors, it appeared as a faint glimmer of salvation in an otherwise hopeless struggle. The Type XX All's innovations were revolutionary in every aspect of submarine warfare. Its batteries were almost 3 times larger than those of the Type 7, allowing it to remain submerged for 2-3 days at speeds that older boats could only achieve for brief moments. With a submerged top speed of 17 knots, it could outrun most Allied escorts while still underwater. This made traditional hunting methods, such as sonar-directed depth charge runs, far less effective. The streamlined hull reduced drag, while its snorkel system allowed diesel engines to operate, while the boat remained submerged at periscope depth. This meant the Electroboot could cross entire oceans with minimal exposure on the surface. Its 6 forward torpedo tubes were reloaded by automated hydraulic systems, enabling it to fire 18 torpedoes in rapid succession, far more than the cumbersome reloading process of older models allowed. Theoretically, a single Type XX All could cripple an entire convoy before evading counterattack. Its advanced hydrophones and sonar equipment gave it a sharper ear beneath the sea, enhancing its ability to detect both prey and pursuers. In sheer design, the Type XX All was a glimpse of the future, a submarine built to dominate the depths, not merely survive them. Yet the brilliance of the Electroboot was undermined by the grim realities of late-war Germany. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns relentlessly targeted German shipyards, crippling production before it could gather momentum. Submarine construction was decentralized, with sections of Type WW2 hulls built in inland factories and transported by rail to coastal yards for assembly. This modular approach was innovative, but riddled with flaws. Poor welding, shoddy construction, and rushed deadlines led to boats that leaked, malfunctioned, or required months of repair before they were seaworthy. Workers often lacked training, and shortages of skilled labor further compromised quality. The result was that many Type WW2 boats never left their slips, condemned by the chaos of a collapsing Reich. For every submarine that neared completion, dozens languished unfinished, skeletons of steel waiting for resources that never came. Even the few completed units required extensive sea trials before becoming operational, and time was running out. The weapon that could have reshaped naval warfare remained largely a blueprint dream, strangled by Germany's industrial collapse. The sailors who trained on the new Electroboot were both awed and frustrated by what they saw. For young recruits, stepping aboard a Type XX was like walking into a vessel from another age. The spacious compartments contrasted sharply with the suffocating confines of earlier U-boats. Air conditioning, refrigeration, and improved bunks made life marginally more bearable, though conditions were still harsh by civilian standards. Most importantly, they felt the thrill of commanding a weapon unmatched by any navy in existence. For veterans who had survived the horrors of depth charge hunts in Type C, the Electroboot represented redemption, a chance to fight back on equal terms. Yet many realized bitterly that they were too late. By the time the Type C1 began sea trials in late 1944, Allied control of the Atlantic was absolute. Convoys were escorted by aircraft, hunter-killer groups, and sonar-equipped destroyers stretched across the ocean. The men trained, prepared, and waited, but few would ever take their new submarine into combat. Their revolution had arrived in a war already lost. The handful of Type XX OLV boats that did enter the Atlantic offered only glimpses of their potential. List 2511, commanded by Adalbert Schnee, conducted its first and only patrol in the dying days of the war. According to reports, Schnee approached a British cruiser undetected, lining up a perfect firing solution. Instead of firing, he followed his orders to disengage, as Germany had already surrendered. His crew watched in silence as the future of submarine warfare slipped away without a shot fired. Other Electroboot completed shakedown cruises, but never engaged Allied convoys. Allied intelligence, however, was keenly aware of the new threat. When captured intact after the war, Type XXX OLV boats shocked naval experts with their design and performance. The realization dawned that had these vessels entered service even a year earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic might have taken a far bloodier course. But fate had intervened, and Germany's miracle weapon had arrived too late. The Electroboot became not a decisive tool of victory, but a symbol of lost opportunity. Allied navies wasted no time in dissecting their captured prizes. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union each took possession of Type WW2 boats and studied them in exhaustive detail. Their findings influenced the post-war submarine fleets of every major power. Navy's Guppy Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program modernization, which upgraded its older fleet boats, drew heavily on Type WW2 war concepts. The Soviet Union, eager to match Western naval power, developed its Whiskey-class submarines by directly copying captured German technology. The Type WW2 streamlined hull, snorkel, and emphasis on underwater speed became standard features in Cold War submarines. In effect, the Electroboot did not win battles for Germany, but laid the foundation for modern undersea warfare. From the nuclear-powered Nautilus to today's fast attack subs, the shadow of the Type Decazest was unmistakable. It was the war's ultimate paradox, a weapon too late to save its creators, but timely enough to revolutionize the future. In its steel lines, one could glimpse the Cold War before the Second World War had even ended. For Karl Donitz, the electroboot became both vindication and torment. He had long argued that Germany needed hundreds of advanced submarines to crush Britain's sea lanes. The Type XX-1 seemed to prove his point, offering capabilities his wolf packs could only dream of. Yet he also knew that the design's arrival in 1945 was meaningless. His submariners were already dead, his fleet shattered, and the Reich collapsing around him. In post-war reflections, Donitz would point to the electroboot as evidence that Germany could have won had the program begun earlier. Critics countered that even advanced submarines could not have outpaced Allied industry and code-breaking. Still, the myth of the wonder weapon lingered, giving post-war Germany a narrative of technical genius stifled by poor timing. For the sailors who never sailed them, however, the electroboot was less a dream and more a cruel reminder of opportunities wasted. It showed them what might have been, but not what was. In the end, the Type XX All Electroboot stands as one of history's great what-ifs. It embodied the ingenuity and desperation of a nation clinging to fading hope. It never altered the outcome of World War II, but it altered forever the course of naval design. The human cost of the U-boat war had already been paid, but the lessons distilled into this final submarine rippled outward into the future. For Allied sailors, its arrival was a chilling reminder of how close the war had come to a different path. For the world's navies, it was a blueprint for the next generation of conflict beneath the seas. Its story is thus not one of triumph, but of transition. From the ashes of defeat, the Type XXXX Ol Colby Tvinduri gave birth to the modern submarine age. And in this strange paradox, Germany's last gamble became the world's future foundation. The electroboot, too late for one war, became the silent architect of the next. By late 1944, the once feared wolf packs of the Atlantic had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. Allied air patrols stretched across vast expanses of ocean, their long-range Liberators and Sunderland flying boats covering waters that had once been safe havens for U-boats. Escort carriers, bristling with aircraft, now sailed alongside convoys, ensuring that no submarine could approach undetected. Destroyer escorts and corvettes prowled with advanced sonar, their crews skilled in hunting submerged enemies. The seas had transformed from a hunting ground into a graveyard for German submariners. Orders from Karl Donitz still demanded aggressive action, but many captains knew their missions were suicide. Patrol zones once rich with unprotected shipping now offered nothing but danger. Every attempt to assemble wolf packs ended with U-boats scattered, destroyed, or forced into desperate evasions. German command, trapped by ideology and denial, continued to send boats into waters they no longer controlled. For the crews, the Atlantic had become a silent coffin, sealing them in steel beneath the waves. The introduction of Allied centimetric radar rendered the ocean transparent in ways U-boat commanders had once thought impossible. Aircraft could detect even the thin periscope or snorkel of a submarine from miles away, swooping in with rockets and depth charges before the Germans had time to react. The snorkel, intended as salvation by allowing boats to remain submerged while recharging, became a liability, betraying their presence to radar operators. Crews endured suffocating conditions when forced to remain deep for days at a time, stale air thick with carbon dioxide. Patrols became tests of endurance, with men gasping for fresh air while listening to the relentless ping of sonar above. When destroyers converged, the ocean itself seemed to erupt with explosions, depth charges, rolling off rails and detonating in terrifying sequences. Each blast shook the hull, showering men with dust and rivets as gauges rattled violently. Fear became constant, a companion as real as hunger or exhaustion. What had once been dangerous but exhilarating hunting expeditions turned into long marches to near certain death. The hunters had become the hunted, and the oceans no longer belonged to them. By this stage of the war, the casualty rate among U-boat crews reached staggering levels. Over 70% of submariners would never return from their patrols, making theirs one of the deadliest assignments in any branch of service during the conflict. The average lifespan of a new U-boat crewman was often measured in weeks, not months. Entire boats vanished without trace, leaving families in Germany waiting endlessly for men who would never return. Survivors spoke of the eerie loneliness of hearing depth charges detonate far above while they sat helplessly beneath the sea. In mess halls back in Germany, empty seats multiplied as returning crews dwindled. Dönitz himself acknowledged the sacrifice, referring to his submariners as the best men of the Reich. Yet even his words offered little comfort, for they knew they were being asked to die for a war already lost. Still, discipline and camaraderie drove them forward into the Black Atlantic. In silence, they prepared themselves for patrols they understood were missions of despair rather than hope. Wolf packs, once symbols of synchronized fury, became increasingly impossible to coordinate. Allied radio direction finding tracked German transmissions with deadly accuracy, ensuring that any boat sending signals risked immediate counterattack. Where once 10 or 20 U-boats could converge on a convoy, by 1944, such efforts ended in destruction before they had even formed. The Atlantic battlefield now favored stealth and evasion rather than coordinated assault. Lone submarines hunted when they could, striking isolated ships or daring convoys from the shadows. But these were brief victories, flashes of old power swallowed quickly by overwhelming reprisals. For captains, the radio itself became both lifeline and death sentence. Orders from Dönitz demanded aggressive communication, but experience taught them silence was the only chance of survival. The Wolfpack doctrine, once feared across the world's oceans, had been dismantled by Allied technology and strategy. Its time had passed, leaving only ghosts of a strategy that had once shaken Britain to its core. In desperation, Germany sought to shift operations to new waters. U-boats ventured into the Arctic, preying on convoys supplying the Soviet Union through Murmansk and Archangel. Others sailed into the Mediterranean, where Allied control of the skies made survival even more precarious. A few boats reached the Indian Ocean, attacking shipping routes near Ceylon and the Persian Gulf in a final attempt to spread chaos. Yet these deployments were scattered and largely symbolic, unable to alter the strategic balance of the war. In each theater, Allied escorts adapted quickly, turning every incursion into another graveyard. Even in remote seas, patrol aircraft appeared with unnerving regularity, as if the Allies had endless eyes across the globe. Captains who once imagined themselves predators realized they were little more than prey, hunted relentlessly wherever they turned. By 1945, U-boats were fighting not for victory, but for survival, clinging to a lost cause. These final operations painted a picture not of glory, but of futility, of brave men expended in battles already decided. For those inside the U-boats, conditions reached almost unbearable levels. Crews lived for weeks in cramped, fetid quarters, surrounded by machinery that hissed, groaned, and leaked under strain. Food spoiled quickly, leaving them gnawing on mouldy bread and rotting potatoes. Hygiene was nearly impossible, with sweat and oil clinging to their bodies until their skin itched and burned. The stench became so strong that survivors remembered it clinging to their clothes long after patrols ended. Sleep came in snatches, broken by alarms and the thud of depth charges above. Each time the hull groaned under pressure, men wondered if the sea would crush them. Some turned to superstition, carrying lucky charms or muttering prayers before dives. Others hardened themselves, focusing only on the routine of machinery and duty to silence their fear. In these claustrophobic steel coffins, the psychological toll was as deadly as any Allied weapon. By the war's end, survivors were less soldiers than survivors of an ordeal few could truly imagine. The final year of the U-boat war exposed the widening gap between German ambition and reality. Dönitz continued to believe that advanced submarines, such as the Type 61 and Type 630, might reverse the tide. But production delays, Allied bombing, and Germany's collapsing infrastructure ensured these boats arrived too late. The majority of crews still sailed in outdated Type 7 or Type 9 models, hopelessly outclassed by Allied technology. Each patrol became an act of stubborn defiance rather than rational strategy. Dönitz's commands, delivered from his headquarters, seemed increasingly detached from the desperate reality at sea. Captains followed orders because disobedience was unthinkable, even as they knew their chances of returning were slim. Some prayed for mechanical failure, preferring an aborted mission to a doomed patrol. Others clung to the hope that one lucky strike might prove their worth before inevitable destruction. By the final months of 1945, the U-boat fleet was no longer an arm of strategy, but a ritual of sacrifice, sent to die in silence beneath the waves. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the U-boat fleet lay shattered, its proud history drowned in oceans of steel and blood. Over 700 boats had been lost, and nearly 30,000 submariners had perished, numbers that told of sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. Harbors along the North Sea and Atlantic coast filled with surrendered U-boats, their black hulls lined in grim rows of defeat. Crews walked ashore not as victors, but as exhausted survivors, relieved that their ordeal had ended. Many had not fired a single torpedo in months, their weapons useless against the Allied wall of steel and air power. For the Allies, the surrender marked not only victory, but vindication. The wolf packs had been broken, their menace extinguished. For Germany, it was the end of a dream of strangling Britain into submission through undersea power. The U-boat war, once a symbol of daring and terror, closed as a tragedy of wasted lives. In its final operations, the Wolfpack legacy was not of glory, but of futility. And in that futility lay one of the starkest lessons of the war, that courage alone cannot triumph against overwhelming odds and unrelenting innovation. By the spring of 1945, the once proud U-boat arm of Germany stood at the edge of total ruin. Patrols that had once sailed boldly into the Atlantic now crept hesitantly from their bases, shadowed immediately by Allied aircraft. Desperate orders continued to pour down from Karl Dönitz, who clung to the hope that some miracle weapon, some stroke of fortune, might still change the tide. Yet the reality was clear to every captain and crewman: the war was lost, and every dive only postponed the inevitable. The Atlantic, once a battlefield of daring, had become an open graveyard where submarines were hunted down within days of leaving port. Bases in France had long since fallen, and those in Norway and northern Germany trembled under constant air bombardment. Even training flotillas, once safe in the Baltic, faced relentless attacks from the air. The vast infrastructure of the U-boat fleet, from shipyards to bunkers, was collapsing alongside the crumbling Reich itself. Fuel shortages meant that boats could barely complete their missions, often ordered to sea without enough to return. Yet the High Command refused to relent, sending young crews into a war that no longer made sense. In this atmosphere of collapse, the wolf packs died not with a roar, but with a slow, suffocating silence. The last missions carried a sense of both futility and resignation. Commanders were told to attack Allied shipping wherever it could be found, but by 1945 the oceans were barren of easy prey. Convoys moved under an iron wall of escorts, aircraft, and hunter-killer groups, leaving no openings for a successful strike. U-boats prowled the coasts of Britain and Ireland in desperation, launching torpedoes at fishing vessels or minor targets in acts of defiance more than strategy. Each attack drew swift retribution as destroyers descended with merciless efficiency. Some boats sank without even firing a weapon, overwhelmed within hours of leaving port. The men knew they were fighting ghosts of the war's past glories, echoes of victories long since erased. Still, they obeyed their orders, the ingrained discipline of the Kriegsmarine binding them to duty. For many captains, the goal shifted from sinking ships to simply surviving long enough to surrender. Yet even survival seemed uncertain in waters where Allied dominance was absolute. It was warfare stripped of meaning, where courage fought endlessly against despair. Donitz, elevated to succeed Hitler in the regime's dying days, clung to the U-boat fleet as the last symbol of German defiance. He believed that continued submarine operations might give Germany leverage in negotiations with the Allies. But the Allies had no interest in compromise, demanding unconditional surrender. Still, Donitz issued orders for boats to remain at sea, even as Berlin crumbled under Soviet artillery. Crews listened in disbelief to radio transmissions, urging them to fight on, knowing their homeland was already burning. Some captains interpreted the orders loosely, choosing to conserve lives by avoiding combat. Others, loyal to the bitter end, carried out their missions with grim determination, even as their chances of returning dropped to near zero. The men who obeyed faced relentless pursuit, each patrol a gauntlet of radar sweeps, depth charges, and airstrikes. Donitz's obsession blinded him to the suffering of his submariners, who became pawns in his illusion of bargaining power. By the final days of April and early May, the fleet was no longer a weapon. It was a scattered collection of doomed steel coffins drifting across the seas. For the crews, surrender became both a relief and a source of uncertainty. Would the Allies treat them with dignity, or would they face punishment as symbols of Nazi terror at sea? Many carried memories of Allied sailors and civilians lost to their torpedoes, wondering if vengeance would now fall upon them. Yet when the orders finally came, the reality was almost anticlimactic. Allied commands broadcasted instructions for U-boats to surface, hoist black flags, and make their way to designated ports. The order, codenamed Regenbogen, Rainbow, was first intended as a plan for scuttling, but Donitz ultimately countermanded it to allow surrender. Hundreds of boats received the signal, and across the Atlantic and North Sea, steel leviathans rose from the depths. Men emerged into the daylight, some weeping, others standing in silence, knowing the war was truly over. In harbours from Norway to Scotland, long columns of surrendered U-boats arrived under escort. Black flags fluttered where once the swastika had flown, a stark image of defeat. The once dreaded wolf packs had been reduced to a fleet of prisoners. The surrender process was staggering in scale. Nearly 150 U-boats gave themselves up at sea, while others were captured in ports or destroyed by their crews. Harbours across the British Isles filled with submarines, Their crews marched into captivity under the eyes of their former enemies. Some Allied sailors, hardened by years of terror from beneath the waves, could not hide their contempt for the men who had waged such a deadly war. Yet others saw only exhausted young faces, boys barely in their 20s, more victims of the regime than villains. The image of endless lines of U-boats in British waters became one of the defining symbols of Germany's maritime defeat. No longer hunters, they sat idle and powerless, stripped of their menace. Donitz's dream of negotiating strength through submarine warfare dissolved instantly, leaving only the ruins of wasted lives. For the Allies, it was vindication that technology, strategy, and endurance had triumphed over terror. For the Germans, it was a moment of collective reckoning, a bitter acceptance that the oceans they once ruled now belonged to others. The Wolfpack era had ended, not with victory, but with surrender en masse. Not all commanders accepted surrender so easily. A handful of U-boat captains, clinging to the ethos of fighting to the last, chose instead to scuttle their boats at sea. They opened valves, flooded ballast tanks, and watched as their vessels slipped beneath the waves forever. For some, it was an act of defiance, a refusal to allow their machines to fall into enemy hands. For others, it was loyalty to the men they had lost, ensuring that no foreign power could claim the steel tombs that had carried their comrades to death. Yet these acts were isolated, mere whispers against the tide of submission. The vast majority obeyed the surrender orders, too weary to prolong the struggle. Even those who scuttled often did so with crews safely evacuated, unwilling to throw away more lives for symbolism. The ocean floor became a grave not just for lost submarines, but for the ideology that had driven them. By May 1945, the final chapter had been written in salt water and silence. The Wolfpacks, once a nightmare for the Allies, vanished into history's depths. For many submariners, captivity was strangely easier than the war itself. Imprisoned in Britain, Canada, and the United States, they found themselves with food, shelter, and safety for the first time in years. The fear of sonar pings, the crushing silence of deep dives, and the terror of depth charges were replaced by monotonous routines behind barbed wire. Some captives reflected bitterly on their service, questioning why they had been sent to die in hopeless battles. Others clung to pride, insisting they had served with honor despite defeat. Interrogators sought technical secrets, prying into the workings of U-boats and the minds of their crews. The captured men spoke of camaraderie, of brothers lost, and of a war that had devoured their generation. Their words revealed not monsters, but weary sailors who had endured the deadliest survival odds of the conflict. Behind every surrender stood stories of endurance, courage, and futility. Their war had ended, but the memory of what they had endured would linger for lifetimes. The collapse and surrender of the U-boat fleet marked both the end of a campaign and the closing of an era in naval history. What began as a vision of strangling Britain into submission had ended as one of the greatest tragedies of men and machines wasted. The U-boat arm had cost the Allies thousands of ships, yet it had cost Germany even more in lives, resources, and moral reckoning. Dönitz himself would face judgment, his legacy tied forever to the sacrifice of submariners sent on hopeless missions. For the Allies, the surrender was proof that persistence and adaptation could overcome terror. For the world, it was a reminder that no weapon, however fearsome, could outlast the combined might of determination and innovation. Rows of surrendered submarines sat as silent monuments to ambition undone by reality. The Wolfpacks were no more, their menace erased by black flags and lowered eyes, and in their end lay the final truth that war at sea is not only fought with torpedoes and steel, but with time, patience, and the resilience of those who refuse to yield. The surrender of the U-boat fleet in May 1945 left the Allies with both a logistical challenge and a symbolic opportunity. Across harbours in Scotland, Northern Ireland and England, hundreds of sleek grey submarines lay moored in eerie silence. Once the terror of the seas, they now sat stripped of menace, manned by exhausted German crews, awaiting captivity. For the Allies, the sheer number of surrendered boats presented questions of disposal, study, and justice. Many were carefully examined by naval engineers, who marveled at their technology, particularly the advanced Type Bix-Excephal electro-boot that hinted at a future of submarine warfare. But not all would be preserved for study. Most would be consigned to destruction. Operation Deadlight was conceived as the plan to rid the seas of these weapons forever. One by one, the U-boats were towed out into the North Atlantic, scuttled, sunk, or left to sink under gunnery practice. For the men who had sailed them, watching their vessels vanish beneath the waves was a moment of profound finality. The Wolfpack fleet, which had once sought to strangle Britain into submission, was now systematically erased from existence. In this act, the Allies sought not only practicality but also closure, ensuring that the menace of the U-boat would never return in its wartime form. Operation Deadlight unfolded between late 1945 and early 1946, a massive undertaking that symbolized the dismantling of Hitler's oceanic ambitions. Nearly 156 U-boats were destroyed, their hulks consigned to the seabed of the Atlantic. Some were scuttled deliberately, with explosive charges placed inside to rend their hulls apart. Others were towed into position, only to sink prematurely when weakened structures gave way during rough seas. British and American ships sometimes used the surrendered submarines for target practice, their guns tearing through the once proud vessels until they slipped beneath the surface. The Atlantic became a graveyard for machines of war, the ocean swallowing steel, as if eager to erase the scars of conflict. A few U-boats escaped this fate, retained by the Allies for study and experimentation, influencing the next generation of naval technology. The rest vanished, unseen except to divers and oceanographers who would rediscover them decades later. Operation Deadlight was both a cleansing ritual and a practical necessity, reducing the U-boat menace to twisted wrecks on the seabed. For Allied sailors who had fought against them, watching the grey sharks disappear into the deep was a vindicating sight. Yet for the German submariners, it was a melancholy farewell to the weapons that had defined their lives and claimed so many of their comrades. The men who had commanded and crewed the U-boats faced their own reckoning. Captains, officers, and enlisted sailors alike were marched into prisoner-of-war camps across Britain, Canada, and the United States. For many, captivity meant relief from the constant terror of depth charges and the brutal odds of survival at sea. But their fates diverged sharply depending on their rank and record. Ordinary crewmen were eventually released, returning to a shattered homeland to rebuild their lives. Commanders and senior officers, however, faced interrogation and scrutiny. Some were accused of war crimes, particularly for actions that blurred the line between military engagement and atrocities. The Nuremberg trials loomed over the higher ranks of the Kriegsmarine, though the U-boat arm was not judged as harshly as the SS or Gestapo. Still, individual captains were tried for incidents of killing survivors or violating international maritime law. For many veterans, the years after 1945 were years of waiting, waiting to be judged, waiting to be released, waiting to redefine their identity in a world that no longer had a place for U-boat warriors. At Nuremberg, the naval presence was smaller than the infamous faces of the Nazi hierarchy, but its role was not forgotten. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of the Wolfpack strategy, and Hitler's successor in the final days, stood trial for crimes against peace and unlawful conduct of submarine warfare. He was accused of ordering unrestricted submarine warfare, attacks on neutral ships, and the denial of safety to survivors of torpedoed vessels. Dönitz defended himself by pointing to the Allied practice of similar tactics, arguing that the Battle of the Atlantic had been fought under equally ruthless conditions on both sides. Despite the severity of the charges, the tribunal sentenced him to 10 years in prison, sparing him the fate of execution that befell other Nazi leaders. His sentence reflected both the recognition of his military skill and the condemnation of his loyalty to the regime. To his supporters, he remained a man who had served his country with honor. To his detractors, he was the cold strategist who sacrificed thousands of young men in a futile campaign. For many former submariners, the trial of their leader felt like the closing act of their shared destiny. In Dönitz's conviction, they saw the symbolic end of the Wolfpacks themselves. Other U-boat officers faced similar trials across Europe, especially in Britain and the United States. Some were charged with the execution of survivors from sunken ships, acts that violated the traditional codes of maritime conduct. In Hamburg, trials were conducted against captains who had ordered such killings, though evidence was often scarce, and many were acquitted. A handful faced death sentences, while others received long prison terms. Yet the majority of U-boat men were not prosecuted, seen instead as soldiers who had carried out lawful combat. This discrepancy reflected the blurred moral lines of submarine warfare, where mercy could mean exposure and death for one's own crew. For the Allies, it was easier to focus their prosecutions on the most notorious figures, leaving thousands of ordinary submariners to quietly fade back into civilian life. Still, the stigma of having served in Hitler's navy lingered. Many veterans found it difficult to speak openly of their service, fearing condemnation in post-war Germany and abroad. Their silence contributed to the mythic aura of the U-boat war, a blend of legend, guilt, and reluctant pride. For the German people, the U-boat fleet's legacy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the submariners were remembered as brave young men who had endured the harshest conditions of the war. Their survival odds had been lower than any other branch of the Wehrmacht, with over 70% never returning from patrols. On the other hand, their role in prolonging the war and terrorizing Allied shipping tied them inseparably to the machinery of Nazi aggression. Post-war Germany struggled to reconcile these images, torn between mourning its sons and acknowledging the crimes of the regime they served. In some towns, memorials to lost submariners stood quietly, honoring their sacrifice without glorifying the cause. Families who had lost sons, brothers, and fathers carried the grief for decades, their mourning mingled with the silence imposed by shame. The reckoning was not only judicial but cultural, a reckoning with memory and meaning. Submariners were neither celebrated as heroes nor universally condemned as villains. They remained shadows of a past Germany struggled to define. Their stories lived on mostly in private conversations, whispered between generations rather than proclaimed in public. The Allies, meanwhile, absorbed the lessons of the U-boat war into their post-war strategies. The few Type XX submarines that had been captured became blueprints for the next era of naval power. Both the United States and the Soviet Union studied the electro-boot designs, laying the foundation for Cold War submarine fleets. In this sense, the Wolfpacks did not disappear entirely. Their innovations echoed into the future of undersea warfare. But the men who had crewed them played no role in this future. They were left behind, their wartime experiences relegated to history, while new generations carried forward the technological legacy. For many U-boat veterans, the knowledge that their sacrifices had built the foundation for others was a bitter irony. They had fought a hopeless battle, and their suffering had served not Germany's victory, but the navies of its enemies. This realization formed part of the post-war reckoning. The wolf packs had died in defeat, but their ghosts sailed beneath new flags. In this way, the U-boat fleet's story did not end. It transformed into a legacy Germany could no longer claim as its own. By the late 1940s, the U-boat war had become part of the larger memory of a world seeking to move on from devastation. Operation Deadlight had consigned most submarines to the ocean floor, and the trials had judged the most infamous leaders. What remained were the human scars, survivors rebuilding lives, widows mourning the lost, and nations haunted by the shadow of submarine warfare. In Germany, silence prevailed for decades, broken only by memoirs and scattered reunions of former crews. In Allied nations, the victory was remembered not only as triumph, but as testimony to endurance against a nearly unbeatable foe. The post-war reckoning was thus layered: judicial punishment, technological appropriation, and cultural memory. Each layer revealed a different truth about the U-boat fleet, from its brutality to its innovation, from its sacrifice to its futility. In the end, the wolf packs were remembered not for their victories, but for their losses. And in those losses lay the final reckoning, a generation of sailors consumed by a strategy that promised dominance but delivered only death. Their legacy remained submerged, half forgotten, yet never erased from the deep waters of history. The story of the U-boat wolf packs remains one of the most defining chapters of the Second World War, its echoes resonating long after the guns fell silent. For 6 long years, these steel predators stalked the Atlantic, striking fear into merchant crews and threatening the very lifeline that connected Britain to the wider world. Their presence shaped Allied strategy, forcing a vast redirection of resources into shipbuilding, escorts, and technology. The Wolfpack campaign demonstrated how a relatively small force could wield disproportionate influence on global warfare. At its height, the U-boat threat nearly strangled Britain into submission, bringing the empire to the edge of economic collapse. Yet the story was not one of triumph, but of eventual ruin, for the Wolfpacks sowed their own destruction by forcing the Allies to innovate at unprecedented speed. The contest became a brutal cycle of action and counteraction, predator and prey locked in a battle where survival demanded constant adaptation. In this way, the Wolfpack legacy is not simply measured in tonnage sunk, but in the transformation of modern naval warfare. Submarines had proven themselves decisive weapons, and navies around the world took note. The oceans were no longer the sole domain of surface fleets. The undersea dimension had irrevocably changed the equation. This realization would shape maritime strategy for generations to come. The legacy of the Wolfpacks is deeply intertwined with the rise of technology as the true victor of the Atlantic War. German submarines initially enjoyed dominance through stealth, discipline, and coordinated tactics. But the Allies responded with innovations that permanently shifted the balance of power. Radar, sonar, high-frequency direction finding, and code-breaking formed a technological shield that turned the hunters into the hunted. The Enigma machine, once the guarantor of secrecy, became a fatal weakness when ultra-intelligence exposed U-boat movements with chilling accuracy. Aircraft carriers, long-range patrol planes, and escort carriers extended Allied reach, ensuring no corner of the ocean was safe. Even the most experienced U-boat commander found his world shrinking under the relentless advance of Allied science. This technological struggle was as decisive as any battle fought with torpedoes and depth charges. It revealed the future of war, intelligence, communication, and machines, as vital as bravery or strategy. The wolf packs forced the Allies to perfect this formula, leaving a legacy of lessons in the marriage of innovation and survival. Without U-boats, the post-war world might never have advanced so rapidly in naval detection and submarine design. Their impact was not just destructive, it was transformative. Yet the Wolfpack campaign also left a human legacy, written in courage, fear, and unimaginable sacrifice. For the men who served aboard U-boats, life was a claustrophobic ordeal marked by constant tension and the knowledge that few would survive. The staggering loss rate, over 70% of U-boat crews never returned, remains one of the highest casualty figures for any branch of service in modern warfare. Each patrol was a gamble with fate, with depth charges raining down in darkness and silence, broken only by the creak of stressed steel. The men who endured this existence left behind diaries, letters, and fragmentary accounts that capture both their bravery and despair. For Allied merchant sailors, the Wolfpack legacy was equally harrowing. Endless voyages under the threat of sudden torpedoes, freezing seas, and fire consuming the decks. Civilians, too, bore the cost, as food shortages and rationing were shaped by the relentless sinkings. The human story is thus central to the legacy, stories of men who fought, suffered, and died in steel coffins beneath the waves. These personal dimensions transform the statistics of tonnage sunk into the reality of lives lost and changed forever. The Wolfpacks were not only weapons of war, but crucibles of human endurance. Their legacy is as much emotional as it is strategic. Strategically, the Wolfpacks stand as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint. The concept of massed submarine warfare proved its effectiveness, but it also revealed its limits in the face of determined and resourceful opposition. Germany's failure to adapt quickly enough, delayed production of advanced submarines, refusal to expand air support, and reliance on outdated tactics sealed the fate of the U-boat arm. Yet the Wolfpacks left behind doctrines that influenced navies worldwide. The Cold War saw both NATO and the Warsaw Pact absorb lessons from the Atlantic struggle, shaping submarine fleets capable of striking across oceans. Nuclear submarines armed with ballistic missiles carried forward the principle of stealthy deterrence first embodied in the Wolfpacks. In this sense, the U-boat war marked the beginning of a new age of undersea strategy. What had started as a desperate gamble to starve Britain became the foundation of global naval doctrine. It was a war that transcended its own time, pointing the way to the submarine as a cornerstone of 20th century military power. The Wolfpacks, though defeated, cast a long shadow over the future of warfare. Their tactics lived on, even as their fleet rusted on the seabed. Culturally, the Wolfpacks became symbols of both fear and fascination. Allied propaganda depicted them as ruthless predators, lurking in the depths to strike without warning. Films, novels, and post-war histories often portrayed the drama of convoy battles, with U-boats as the faceless menace of the sea. Yet within Germany, especially after the war, the narrative shifted toward tragedy and sacrifice. The young submariners were remembered not as villains, but as doomed warriors, sent to their deaths in a campaign already lost. Memoirs and accounts humanized their plight, capturing the tension of silent patrols and the agony of endless losses. This duality, fear in the Allied memory, martyrdom in the German one, formed a complex legacy that continues to shape perceptions of the U-boat war. Even today, divers who explore the wrecks of U-boats describe a sense of solemn reverence, recognizing them as underwater graveyards. Literature and cinema, from Das Boot to countless documentaries, keep alive the aura of the Wolfpacks as both terrifying and tragic. They became more than weapons. They became stories, myths, and symbols. This cultural imprint ensures that their legacy remains vivid, not just in history books but in imagination. The wolf packs also left an enduring legacy in the memory of the nations they targeted. For Britain, the Battle of the Atlantic became a defining struggle for survival, a national story of endurance under siege. For the United States, the fight against U-boats in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean highlighted the vulnerability of its shores, prompting long-term naval expansion. Canada, too, carried the scars, with its navy forged in the crucible of convoy escort duty. For neutral nations whose ships were sunk, the Wolfpack War blurred the boundaries of legality and morality, leaving resentment and sorrow. Across the world, the U-boat menace shaped wartime diplomacy, strategy, and post-war planning. Survivors of merchant sinkings carried trauma for decades, their memories of burning ships and cold seas etched into family histories. Communities that relied on shipping never forgot the terror of the Atlantic gauntlet. In this way, the Wolfpack's legacy is not limited to Germany or the Allies. It is global. The war at sea touched every continent, every shipping lane, every neutral port. The Wolfpacks etched their name into the collective memory of nations, both through destruction and through the resilience they inspired. Technologically, the Wolfpack's impact cannot be overstated. The Typex XNS Electroboot, though arriving too late, set the stage for the modern submarine. Its streamlined design, snorkel system, and submerged endurance became the model for post-war fleets. The Allies' innovations in radar, sonar, and intelligence not only won the war, but laid the foundation for Cold War naval supremacy. The chess match between submarines and countermeasures became permanent, with every advancement sparking a new counter in an endless cycle of innovation. In this sense, the Wolfpack War was not an end, but a beginning. Submarines became silent guardians of nuclear arsenals, inheriting the mantle once held by U-boats prowling the Atlantic. Every submarine that glides beneath the waves today owes something to the lessons of the Wolfpack era. The strategies, technologies, and doctrines forged in fire during World War II remain embedded in the DNA of modern naval power. The Wolfpacks, though defeated, were not erased. They were reborn in new forms, under new flags, carrying forward the legacy of undersea warfare. Their ghost sails with every submarine patrol, haunting the oceans with echoes of the past. In the final reckoning, the legacy of the U-boat Wolfpacks is one of paradox. They were simultaneously brilliant and disastrous, innovative and obsolete, heroic and tragic. They nearly broke the Allies, but ultimately hastened their own destruction by forcing relentless innovation. They left behind wrecks at the bottom of the ocean, yet also blueprints for the future. They are remembered with fear by those who faced them, but with sorrow by those who served within them. Their story remains one of the most dramatic contests of the Second World War, a struggle that decided the fate of nations through silent duels beneath the waves. The Wolfpack's enduring place in history lies not only in tonnage sunk or lives lost, but in the transformation they unleashed upon the modern world. They proved that the ocean, vast and unyielding, could become the deadliest battlefield of all. And they demonstrated that technology, courage, and strategy would forever define the wars of the future. The Wolfpacks, in their rise and fall, left behind a legacy as deep and enduring as the waters they once prowled. Their story is finished, yet their influence endures, shaping the seas of tomorrow.